Millennials, also referred to as Generation Y, are the generational group who follow Generation X and are typically categorized as people born between 1980 to the mid-1990s. Millennials are also sometimes referred to as Echo Boomers due to a major surge in birth rates in the 1980s and 90s. Generation Z, or Gen Z, is the generational group that came after the Millennials, born between the mid-1990s up to the mid-2000s. Generation Z is also referred to as the I generation, iGen, or post-millennials. How do these generations compare? That's what we'll be looking at today, in this episode of the infographic show, Millennials versus Generation Z. Though these two groups sit side by side on the generation ladder, the expansion of the internet and the leaps that have been made with the digital revolution has seen them exposed to a host of different experiences. Add to that the influence of parents from different generations, and we have plenty of scope for differences in attitude and behavior. We've reviewed what researchers have said, so we can bring you our list of 10 ways these generations compare and differ. Let's take a look. Number 1. Attention span. Generation Z processes information faster than any other generation, including millennials. They live in a high-tech world of constant updates, and having grown up with access to apps such as Vine and Snapchat, their attention span is likely to be lower than that of millennials. A study showed that while only 4% of millennials and older generations believe 13 is an okay age for owning a smartphone, as high as 18% of Generation Z members think it is an okay age. Number 2. Multitasking. A short attention span is not always a drawback, and what Generation Z lack in focus, they make up for in their multitasking capabilities. Generation Z can work on a school assignment on their computer and do research on their tablet, all while taking notes. And in the evening, they will often sit in front of the TV watching a movie, at the same time chatting with a friend on Facebook from their phone or laptop. It's head-spinning stuff. Number 3. Independent versus collaborative. 71% of Generation Z say they live by the phrase, if you want it done right, then do it yourself. Generation Z tend to be more competitive and will adopt a do-it-yourself mindset in personal or professional activities. And when it comes to workspaces, 69% of Generation Z would rather have their own workspace than share it with others, whereas millennials would opt for a collaborative working environment where they can team up with their colleagues. Number 4. The digital pioneers. 40% of Generation Z say that reliable Wi-Fi is more important than reliable bathrooms. And according to Pew Research, only 14% of US adults had access to the internet in 1995, but by 2014, 87% had access. Millennials saw firsthand how social media revolutionized the way in which we communicate. They were pioneers in the digital age, witnessing the birth of smartphones, instant messaging, and internet searching capability. Generation Z were born into this tech-immersed society and so have a very different perspective. Number 5. Face-to-face or digital chat. All this technology has also had an effect on how these generations differ with communication habits, and 74% of Generation Z say they prefer to communicate face-to-face with colleagues in the workplace. As we just mentioned, millennials pioneered many of the digital communication tools, which revolutionized how we do business. But with Generation Z preferring a more personal approach, maybe they are the ideal generation to strike the right balance between online and offline workplace communications. Number 6. Optimistic vision. A 2016 survey conducted by Lincoln Financial Group tells us that Generation Z are far more optimistic than the millennials. 50% of Generation Z say America is heading in the right direction versus 42% of millennials. 64% of Gen Z have started researching or talking to others about their financial futures by age 13. And after they've started having those conversations, 95% of those making financial plans feel optimistic about their future in general. Number 7. Convenience over brands. Accenture research tells us that Generation Z love tech-driven, fast shopping experiences like one-hour delivery, activated shopping, and in-store kiosks. Brands are less important, and they'll happily switch retailers who are better at providing these services. And they see shopping as a social experience. They like to consult friends and get opinions on products. They can be unforgiving when leaving reviews for retailers, and are also twice as likely to consult YouTube as millennials before making a purchase. Number 8. Different ways of learning. 75% of Generation Z say there are other ways of getting a good education other than the traditional route of going to college, according to Sparks and Honey research. And Generation Z has the beauty of hindsight on their side to see how things panned out for their counterparts. Many millennials now have large student debts and have been left questioning whether it was worth it, with 44% of recent college grads employed in jobs that do not require a degree. Number 9. Tolerance. Millennials tend to be more tolerant than Generation Z, as they have generally encountered more situations in life where things have the potential to go wrong. For Generation Z, it's all about getting the job done, and problems for them usually mean it's time to look elsewhere. As an example, if Generation Z experience a technical hitch when making an online purchase, it's unlikely they'll visit that store again, whereas Millennials will be more lenient and likely give the store a second chance. And finally, number 10. Social influencers are today's celebrities. Generation Z are more likely to be browsing YouTube than sitting in a movie theater. 63% of them say they prefer to see real people than celebs in their ads. So it's pretty obvious we've probably got a large percentage of Generation Z viewers here at the infographic show.
The dating landscape sure has changed a lot. Back in the day, a person might place an ad in the personals part of the newspaper. Something like avid reader, vivacious vixen, seeks intelligent Prince Charming for nights out in the city. Then the girl would wait a week for a timid reply. These days, you can scroll right or left on a plethora of unashamedly enhanced photos, reading things like "no hookups and no dick pics please." People in the past also had to pick up courage and approach potential dates in bars. These days, even the shyest creature can act like a Don Juan within the safety of a dating app. Now we have fewer terrible chat-up lines delivered in smoky enclosures and more short messages sent to a server somewhere. Does this mean more dating success? First of all, what is Generation X? Mostly when we're talking about this generation, we mean people born sometime in the 60s until the early 80s. So while Gen X might still be in the dating game, they will likely have also been dating well before dating apps and dating websites were a thing. This is the generation that is sometimes called the MTV generation. Kids that grew up with late punk, grunge music, hip-hop with an attitude, in Britain's the rave era and Britpop. Kids who cried to E.T., thought Pac-Man was groundbreaking tech, and who watched on as the Berlin Wall came tumbling down. Meanwhile, Millennials, sometimes called Generation Y, are the people born anywhere from the mid-80s until the early 2000s. These are the children who grew up with dubstep, witch house, neopunk, and a version of hip-hop with more bling. They watched reality TV, and many were impressed by video games with incredible stories and graphics that made gameplay almost real. They had wars on terror, a financial crisis, and they became the first generation to experience as children a hyper-connection due to an explosion of new technologies. You get the picture. It's these hyper-connections that have made dating for Millennials much different than it was for Generation X when they first developed into mature human beings. Dating might be easier these days, but that doesn't equate to more people tying the knot, at least in the USA. Pew Research tells us that over the last quarter of a century, fewer people have been getting married. The number of folks getting hitched is a bit less than it was a decade ago, but it seems Millennials and Generation X are quite similar in terms of numbers getting married. But quite surprisingly, with the ease of dating, it seems more Americans are now single. The Christian Science Monitor tells us that the number of Americans in relationships has been going down since the 50s. Even though Generation X has dated less and stayed single longer than those before them, Millennials right now are even more likely to be single. That report said in terms of marriages, not just dating, 78% of households in America in the 50s were home to married couples. In 2011, it was 48%. In 2014, it said that 50.2% of the American population over the age of 16 was single, even with dating apps. Back in 1976, admittedly a bit early for Generation X, 37.4% of Americans over the age of 16 were single. What the article told us is that Americans are just dating less, either choosing to remain single or they just can't get a date. Even though more people are single, many folks are actually using dating apps. They are joining the buffet, so to speak, but are taking their sweet time to eat something. Pew Research tells us that in 2013, 10% of Americans aged 18 to 24 were using dating apps or dating websites. In 2015, that rose to 27%. It's about 40% for all American adults, and all 47% of Americans in the dating game said that using the technology is an easier way to meet people than the old-school approach. So why are people dating less? Sociologists tell us that one of the reasons is more people are chasing their careers. Getting married young and getting stuck with kids is hardly the best way to get ahead as a professional or entrepreneur. The younger generation also wants to see the world. We might look at international travel. Something for many Gen Xers wasn't easy. Back in the 80s or 90s, visiting the beaches of Goa or getting wasted in Bangkok's red light district was for quite daring travelers. These days, travel has been made easy and it's almost a rite of passage to get away to a distant land. Perhaps millennials are not getting married so quickly so they can fulfill their traveling dreams. Saying that, in 2017, Forbes wrote that millennials were globetrotting more than Gen X. But the article was about how married millennials are traveling more. That article also said millennials are doing more trips to exotic places for bragging rights, as these days the photo album is shared with everyone. Total strangers often, on platforms such as Facebook and Instagram. While Gen X enjoyed classic road trips like the often lampooned Griswold family, millennial families are taking travel to a whole other level, concluded the article. So in terms of dating, we might say that work ambitions and adventure are two big reasons millennials are more single than Gen X's. That's just one reason for more single people. Millennials, if they so choose, can literally look at hundreds of dating profiles in a matter of hours. One dating therapist said it's a very American idea that choice is freedom and freedom is choice, but it can really cripple you if you have too much choice. Others have called this a paradox of choice, the irony being that in front of you have a myriad options, but because you have so many, you get nothing. Back to the restaurant analogy, Gen X's went to a place that had 6 things on the menu, and they were happy about that. Millennials, on the other hand, go to a restaurant that has 2,785 items on the menu. It takes so long to read the damn thing that they leave the place with an empty stomach. And anyway, there's another spot uptown that has another menu with more treats. So you think you'll wait it out and try that place next. The privilege of choice causes ridiculous high expectations, writes a critic for Thought Catalog. Add to that some people actually believe their online persona and edited photo is really them. They're too good to be true, and if they keep this illusion up, they can keep sending messages to others that are doing the same thing. If they stay in the bubble, they can keep getting attention, but if they have to show their true selves, the bubble bursts and the illusion is revealed as a kind of magic trick. Some people prefer to stick with the illusion. On the other hand, we're also told that the hookup culture is thriving. Another report says that millennials are having a lot of one-night stands compared to Gen X, but not actually dating. For some people, that picture they sent to a stranger of their phallus was met not with consternation but gratitude. Then they get it on, and that's that, the end. No flowers, no meeting the parents, no walks in the park. Just a single night of sweaty carnality. Some writers have said that we're almost living in a post-dating world. That's not to say Gen X is not part of this too, but that it's been normalized for millennials. They've grown up with this, it's not unusual, whereas Gen X might be still reminiscing about the days when they made someone a mixtape starring Nirvana and the Butthole Surfers. Perhaps some of that generation might think dating sites have made dating a little less romantic. Instead of a mixtape these days, it's more likely to send someone a picture or video of themselves. We might ask if such narcissism has made dating less attractive for some Gen Xers. As you know, we're told that around 40% of Americans in total use online dating apps and sites. According to one report, women get the most attention when they are 21, but they get more actual pursuers when they reach 26. Men, on the other hand, can stay popular in older age. When both males and females are 48, men have twice as many online pursuers as women. According to that same report, most women were using the tech to find relationships, not just a hookup. In another article by Esquire, it was written that 50% of all users don't want anything. They just use the app because they're bored. Most of those were women. Psychology Today tells us that there is more trouble with online dating. In a study, it cited more than 50% of people admitted to lying in their dating profile. Women often used younger photos of themselves, while men lied about what they did for a living. In terms of dating, we can see that this might preclude people from actually meeting. Hi, my name is Janice, and that photo you liked was me 14 years ago, edited in beauty mode. Nice to meet you, I'm John, and I'm an unemployed raging alcoholic, not a fitness freak working in the valley. You've never had this problem when Gen Xers were dating as youngsters. The same article said that another problem when people are not face-to-face is that they can act without manners. Women should be aware that they will probably receive rude and disgusting messages from horny guys, sexual propositions and requests, dick pics, and a lot of creepy vibes, it said, which is something most guys don't do in public. Another thing the article pointed out is that even when people do date that met online, the relationships on average don't last as long as people that met offline. Let's face it, when you fall for someone in real life, you see their many traits. You fall for their aura. That's something special that you can't explain. On the other hand, it may take 3 dates to realize the online person you fell for is not attractive to you at all. You fell for a creation, and when you met, you deluded yourself that this creation was real. It was merely her fiction and your fantasy, and vice versa. Nonetheless, online dating is booming. As of 2017, 8.2 million people in the US were using Tinder, 6.7 million were using Plenty of Fish, 5.1 million were on Match, and 5.1 million were on OkCupid. But how do they work? There are many articles that say using a dating app doesn't mean you'll be dating more than generations that didn't use them. On the whole, dating apps get more criticism than plaudits.
You kids and your TikToks. When I was your age, we were working in the mines.
Grandpa grumbles between mouthfuls of mashed potatoes. Okay, boomer, your 12-year-old cousin fires back, eyes glued to his iPhone. Skippity toilet. And there you are frantically scrolling through job listings trying to find a side hustle to cover, well, living. But how did we get here? Why does it feel like the generations are at war? It wasn't always like this. Sure, back in the 1800s, they probably complained about how those darn 1812ers were ruining the Revolutionary War's generation's hard-fought legacy. But this idea of labeling people by generations and turning it into a culture clash, that's actually a 20th century invention. Generations used to be simple family labels until someone decided, hey, let's study this and fight about it. And now we have 7 distinct generations, each thinking they're doing things right. But why does this feel like a battleground for who's really to blame for the world's problems? That's exactly what we're breaking down in this episode of The Infographic Show, Every Generation Explained. Find out exactly where you fit into this generational showdown. The Greatest Generation, 1901 to 1927. This generation was born at the start of a new century filled with promise, progress, and excitement. But naturally, history had different plans. The early years of this generation would be filled with massive upheaval, with many seeing World War I unfold and being haunted by the specter of the Spanish flu. But amid this, they saw many leaps in culture, as the Roaring '20s took off and brought jazz and swing music to the mainstream. But with every up comes a down, and the Great Depression hit, as many of them were approaching adulthood, plunging the entire world into economic uncertainty. And then the rumblings of war started. And that's how this generation earned their name. Most of this generation were fighting age when World War II broke out, and they became associated with the most iconic military triumph the United States had ever seen. Although there were many losses, they returned home to celebrations and went on to great success in business, culture, and of course, politics. It's believed there are over 100,000 members of this generation still alive. So if you're lucky enough to know one, ask them to tell you a crazy story about the good old days. With a legacy this large, there is no surprise the next generation was sort of overshadowed. Silent Generation, 1928 to 1945. The Silent Generation was also shaped by these world events, but not in the same way, as they grew up in a world in flux. The Depression shaped their childhood, leading to many growing up in unsettled circumstances, and the war caused wartime rationing. Many saw parents die in combat and grew up in a deeply patriotic environment. Speaking out against the government was frowned upon, and a strong sense of collectivism was encouraged. And that's how this generation got its name, because as soon as one war ended, another began. This was the first generation largely defined by the Cold War. The threat of communism was already alive and well in America before this generation was born. But once the Soviet Union got nukes, it was all hands on deck. The name comes from the fact that most of them were silent during the McCarthy era, keeping their heads down and maintaining a strong work ethic that had been instilled in them since childhood. That kind of low-key behavior leads to them often being forgotten as a key generation. Baby Boomers, 1946 to 1964. The term baby boomers comes from the baby boom of the late 1940s and 1950s, as all the World War II veterans returned home and the economy recovered from the Depression and wartime footing. The result? A higher standard of living for Americans, a fast advance in commerce and technology, and a whole lot of woohoo! And soon the babies started coming, resulting in a massive generation of over 76 million Americans alone, making them the largest generation. And they grew up in a world that saw progress come fast. This was the age of the space race, of the civil rights movement, of Woodstock, and of changes that led to what most people view as a typical American childhood. But it was also an age of uncertainty and terror. If the words duck and cover cause you to dive under the nearest table, you might just be a baby boomer. This was the era when nuclear annihilation was the clearest and most present threat, as events like the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink. Thus, baby boomers were raised to be cautious and deeply patriotic. But this was also the era of the Vietnam draft and the massive anti-war movement that followed, something that continues in how they impact politics to this day. They've had 4 presidents: Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, and Trump. They have a reputation for leaning conservative, and their easier road in the economy and employment rankles the younger generations. But they're as ideologically diverse as the other generations, and as they reach retirement age by the millions each year, they show no signs of their influence waning. With the boomers casting such a long shadow, is it any surprise the next generation is a little more zen? Generation X, 1965 to 1980. Known as the slacker generation by many of the older generations, Generation X largely escaped one major trial by fire, a major war that swept them up. While the baby boomers largely fought in Vietnam, this generation saw the latter days of the Cold War as tensions started to slowly ease. The most significant war of this period, the Gulf War, was a limited conflict that didn't involve a draft, and that led to them becoming far more involved in domestic affairs and far more willing to question the powers that be. This was the era where LGBT rights became a key issue and when the AIDS epidemic swept the world. And while the world might not have been in as much danger of immediate annihilation, change was going to come fast, and much of that cultural shift would be on the TV. Today, Generation X is the most associated with not what they did, but with what they watched and listened to. This is the era that MTV came on the air, and the beginnings of the grunge movement stepped into the stage. It also saw a disturbing rise in kidnappings and the rise of the satanic panic, as fears shifted to the home front and parents became more protective of their kids, spelling an end to the age of free-range childhood and the beginning of helicopter parenting. Much like the silent generation, this generation is often seen as overshadowed by the one sandwiching it, and it has never had a president even as its older members approach 60. Now it's time to shift to the kids. Wait, they're how old now? Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Coming of age as the Cold War breathed its last and a new era began, the Millennials are associated with one thing more than any other: technology. This generation experienced a lot of whiplash in their early years, growing up in the era of Toys R Us and wall phones as kids, seeing the internet born as they grew up, and entering a new digital landscape as they hit high school or college. For the Millennials, especially those who saw the calendar roll over to 2000 as they approached adulthood, the world seemed full of promise and excitement. Surely it was all uphill from here. But just like the greatest generation, history had its way of throwing a spanner in the works. As soon as the new millennium rolled over, chaos seemed to ensue. A near-tied presidential election with a controversial resolution led many millennials to become dissatisfied with politics. The 9/11 attacks in New York and Washington kicked off a global war on terror. And while there was no draft like in previous generations, it cast a pall over young adulthood for many. Then the 2008 financial crisis upended many millennials' career plans. This has set them back in many ways, with many living at home with their parents long after previous generations and struggling to find long-term employment. This has also led to this generation becoming highly liberal, with many of the generation's young politicians being iconoclasts, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. But while millennials are often used as shorthand for young people, here's a scary statistic. The older millennials are now over 40, which means some of them are already grandparents, which means it's time for someone else to say, "Okay, millennial." Generation Z, 1997 to 2010. If millennials got a crash course in technology as they grew up, Gen Z are digital natives, with almost all of them growing up with the internet being a part of everyday life. They likely got cell phones at a relatively young age, and those quickly changed to smartphones, essentially giving them a computer in their pocket all the time. When the boomers talk about kids these days will never understand, they mean this generation. The majority of Gen Z has never likely worked on a typewriter, used whiteout, or scanned a newspaper for movie listings. To which they would answer, "Why would we need to?" But if you think that means that they've checked out of reality, think again. One thing has been clear about this generation as they get older, and it's that they are highly engaged in politics and social issues, with the internet being key in increasing their awareness. They've played a key role in the anti-war, gun control, and anti-climate change movements, but often prefer confrontational protest movements to voting and organizing in the traditional way. This has caused no shortage of headaches for older generations, but progress usually only goes one way, and it's still uncertain how they're going to impact politics around the world as they get older. Which raises the question, what is the next generation going to look like? Gen Alpha, 2011 to ? How do you judge a generation that's just barely started? Well, if you ask most older people, they have no problem. Much like Gen Z were digital natives, Gen Alpha are smartphone natives, which means they've never known a world without the constant stream of information at their fingertips. This has led to worries from teachers about them having trouble with reading and attention span, as they're just so used to getting their information from short-form video like TikTok, and they're growing up just as AI becomes a massive concern. But like with every generation, there's another side to that. Even more so than Gen Z, Gen Alpha is highly engaged in activism and passionate about justice. They're also the most tech-savvy generation ever, not just playing it but creating it. More than half of American kids under 16 are members of Roblox, a site that allows them to code games. But they're growing up in a world that's more unsettled than it has been since the Cold War, and many older people are worried about these kids getting radicalized in both directions. And as they enter high school and college, we'll see how they start influencing the world. Which is to say, we should expect some more dinner table arguments. In our famous You Versus series, we've pitted you, the average Joe, up against some truly despicable, horrible, and terrifying opponents. We've matched you up against Annabelle, the demon doll, as well as the Terminator. We've even pitted you up against the guy she told you not to worry about, and spoiler alert, you totally had to worry about him. But today, you're gonna face a truly insidious, horrifying, and all too real evil that stalks our modern life. You're going to face off against a wicked force that's not only all around you, but runs your banks, your job, your very government. This evil is the single most insidious threat the world has ever faced. Yes, today you're going to be facing off against a baby boomer. The date is 1945, and both Germany and Japan have surrendered to the Allies. The bloodiest war in human history is finally at an end, and in the wake of all that violence, the continent of Europe has been left in ashes. This war has broken the old system. The fighting was so horrific and so complete that the mighty European empires which ruled the world for centuries are no more. Back home in the United States, millions of soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines are discharged from service. Well-earned parades are thrown and celebrations ring out across the nation. America, the international underdog, had entered the war reeling from the most devastating surprise attack in its history. Yet, with famous American gumption, the armed forces of the United States quickly mustered and set themselves up to help liberate Europe and Asia from the grip of the Axis power. The celebrations spill over into the bedrooms across the country, and 9 months later, a wave of victory babies are born to young budding families across the nation. This trend of euphoric celebratory baby making would continue on, lasting all the way until 1960. This generation would come to be known as the baby boomers, and they would prove to be a scourge on America more foul than Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan ever dreamed it could be. To fight your enemy, you must know your enemy. So what exactly is a boomer? What makes them so dangerous, and how can you defeat one? One cannot understand the boomer until they understand the world they grew up in. Today's generations are spoiled with technology and have a world of convenience at their fingertips, yet no generation in human history has been more overprivileged than the boomers. Boomers grew up in the post-World War II era, when America stood alone as the only industrialized nation that hadn't been ravaged by war. Following the war, American factories produced the raw materials and consumer goods that rebuilt Europe. As those nations struggled to get both their industrial base and transportation infrastructure up and running again, American goods were sold across the world and for years faced no significant competition anywhere in the globe. This created an economic boom for America that is unparalleled to this day. World War II had devastated the industrialized powers, but quickly after its end, American capitalists birthed the age of globalism. The huge demand for American goods led to an explosion of well-paying jobs across the country, and this in turn created something that today's generations talk about only in whispers: the fabled middle class. Yes, that's right, viewer. Once upon a time, in the distant pages of ancient history, about 40 or 50 years ago, there existed sea monsters at the edge of the world map, unicorns that lurked deep in the woods and granted magical wishes with their enchanted horns, and the most legendary of all beings, the American middle class. This social class stood firmly between the slovenly, unwashed lower working poor classes and the esteemed aristocracy. Their incomes allowed them to secure future financial security by purchasing property, an asset that was more sure than gold and the single best financial investment in the world. We know, dear viewers, you're probably ready to rage in the comments and call us fake news, but we promise you that we did our research. And yeah, in fact, there existed once upon a time an American economy where the layperson could afford to to buy a home on an average income and not be a lifelong serf. We mean renter of apartments. Though, when you think about it, can you honestly tell us the difference between a serf and the modern renter? You both own nothing. You work to pay your lord for the privilege to live on his property. You have no hope of ever changing your financial situation because rent prices keep going up. Sorry, we went on a bit of a tangent there. Anyway, boomers were born into this wonderful economy which not only provided them with great paying jobs, but affordable education that ensured upward mobility for the average person. A boomer could actually work a single part-time job and pay for their college tuition. And to be clear, we're not saying this was the case for literally everyone in America during this time. The boomers we're talking about are the primarily white, Christian, and heteronormative ones that made up the vast majority of the generation we're talking about. But we wanted to make it clear that we're aware this wasn't the reality for many minority groups. So again, before you take to the comment section and call us fake news, please bear with us. But now back to what life was like for the majority of boomers. In 1950, the average household income was $3,300. The average home price was $7,354. The average car cost $1,510, and tuition to the University of Pennsylvania was only $600. That means that a 1950 home cost 222% of a family's income. The car cost 45% and tuition cost 18%. Let's compare that with today's numbers. Today, the average wage in America is $48,252. The average home costs $227,000. A car costs about $30,000, and tuition to the same University of Pennsylvania costs $57,770. This means that while a home cost 222% of a family's income in 1950, today a home costs 470%. A car costs 45% of a family's income and today costs 62%. And tuition has skyrocketed from 18% of income to 119%. As you consider that last figure there on tuition, please try and remember that this does not include the price of books, food, housing, and all other kinds of fees. All fees you're now expected to pay in order to have a chance at a better life. Perhaps now you're starting to see why boomers are such an insidious threat. Not only are they one of the most overprivileged of generations, but tragically, one of the defining characteristics of a boomer is a genetic defect that makes it impossible for them to realize this. Much like lions have trouble seeing striped animals on the plains of the Serengeti, a boomer in its natural habitat is not only entitled due to all the socioeconomic advantages they enjoyed thanks to their economy their parents created, but are unable to see how the world has changed and our current reality is not the same that they grew up in. To a boomer, they were able to afford their low-cost tuition with one job and no loans, so the only reason you can't afford your tuition is because you're lazy and eat Tide Pods while doing the Instagram all day. It has nothing to do with how the economy has changed and wages have stagnated for 4 decades while the cost of everything has increased exponentially. It's definitely your self-entitlement and all that Twitter you do. And to be clear, we're not saying this was the case for literally everyone in America during this time. The boomers we're talking about are the primarily white, Christian, and heteronormative ones that make up the vast majority of the generation we're talking about, but we wanted to make it clear that we're aware this was not the reality for many minority groups. Curiously though, boomers, like most wild animals, show a keen sense of self-preservation when threatened, recognizing that the current economy has for a decade and a half been unfavorable for homebuyers. Most boomers today are refusing to move and purchase new houses, instead opting to stay living in the same houses they originally purchased with affordable loans backed up with secure, high-paying jobs throughout the 1970s and 80s. This has served to drive housing prices even further up, and thus even more out of reach of the newer generations. Boomers aren't just content to destroy your chances at owning property and establishing financial security, though. They're actively seeking to destroy the very environment that you live in. The same refusal to acknowledge that the modern American economy is not the same economy they grew up in also extends to environmental issues. Back in the boomers' day, the Earth was still experiencing environmental stability, and the consequences of climate change were decades away. While a wild animal can sense a change in its environment which could threaten its survival, and thus flee to a new, more hospitable environment, the boomer is completely unable to recognize that not only is its environment changing, but that its own life is now in danger as well due to that same environmental change. Worst of all, while the boomer retains all the leadership positions in government and industry which could today stop or curb climate change, the boomer is apathetic to the threat as it will die long before the most horrible effects of climate change start to rear their head, saddling today's generations with even more catastrophic ruin brought about by their apathy. The boomer doesn't need to believe in climate change because it'll be dead before it has to deal with the consequences. Boomerus spoiled-bratus, the scientific name for the boomer species, is an insidious parasitical life form that leeches the vitality of not just current American generations, but the very environment those generations live in. The boomer has a sense of self-entitlement that is completely undeserved and blinds the boomer to the fact that the robust American economy they enjoyed and granted them so many privileges was not in fact of their own making, but built by their fathers and mothers. Naturally, this does not stop the boomer from taking credit anyway. Left to its own devices, the boomer parasite will bleed the national economy dry, concentrate wealth within the top 1%, destroy the same middle class that enabled their current comfortable retirements and financial security, and pretty much just crap all over the environment. These parasitic life forms will then burden the new generations with the consequences of all their terrible decisions, completely oblivious to the fact that while their own parents left them a robust, healthy economy that afforded opportunity to all, they've left us with a broken market that favors only the wealthy, fails to provide an adequate living wage, and has made tuition costs so prohibitively expensive that even if you pursue higher education to better yourself, you'll still end up saddled with so much debt that you'll most likely never be able to rise above your economic class. Instead of taking responsibility for their past decisions or acknowledging the new economic reality they themselves created, boomers will instead look down their noses at younger generations protesting climate change and economic inequality and call them socialists or spoiled brats who want everything given to them for free. So, how are you going to defeat the boomer? Well, much like anti-vaxxers and people who insist on taking homeopathic treatments, the boomer has a natural resistance to facts. The natural environment of a boomer is a fact-free echo chamber of its own creation, where it can feed off other boomers on popular media such as radio or television who complain all day about kids today being entitled, and that if you really wanted a house, all you had to do was work hard and squeeze those few extra pennies from your paycheck, just like they did back in their day. You can attempt to show a boomer how, when you account for inflation, American wages have not increased since the 1970s, while medical, housing, and education prices have skyrocketed. But much like a concerned rhinoceros who feels its safety is threatened, the boomer will not only ignore these facts, but will likely turn aggressively hostile. Sadly, there's only one way to defeat the boomer, and it's not to hand-wave away whatever forwarded email-born argument they're presenting with the pithy reply of "Okay, boomer." No, the best way to defeat the boomer is to simply outlive them. While modern medicine has made the boomer parasite resistant to the effects of aging, leading scientists believe that the boomer plague will see a substantial population decrease over the coming decades. By 2030, most boomers will be expired, freeing up the leadership positions in government and industry that they've held onto for decades. Only when boomers are no longer alive and in charge so they can ruin things can you truly defeat them and start to undo all of the catastrophic damage they've caused our society and our environment. Let's just hope it isn't too late by then. There's no complete data that tells us which era had the most active global serial killers. If we look at the USA alone, though, in the 70s and 80s, they did seem to have a lot of maniacs killing multiple people. It was the 1970s when we first had serious criminal profiling as we know it today, as you might have seen in the show Mindhunter. Such profiling techniques were used to track down the likes of the notoriously brutal Ted Bundy. Psychological profiling was not just used to track down serial killers, but it is the modus operandi of killers that has made the most compelling tales. Are these profilers about to get very busy? That's what we'll find out today in this episode of the Infographic Show. Why this generation might have more serial killers than ever. Okay, so let's look more closely at the question of if the 70s and 80s really had more serial killers. The BBC asked this, and indeed the conclusion was, yes, it is a fact. The Beeb interviewed a man who had been studying serial killers for many years. He said serial killing started becoming more common in the 1960s, and then got even worse in the 70s and peaked in the 80s. We might recall the names of some of the worst killers we've ever heard about in the aforementioned Ted Bundy, and add him to the likes of John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, William Bonin, the Freeway Killer, or over in the UK, the infamous Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper. Why did all these killers emerge during these decades? Criminologist James Allen Fox told the BBC there were a few reasons. He said all violent crime, at least in the US, was on the rise during that era, mainly due to the fact that people were moving around a lot more. Folks often didn't know their neighbors, and of course vulnerable people often hitchhiked in those days. It just created an environment which was ideal for serial killers to prey on victims, said the criminologist. Add to that, the police didn't yet have large databases in which to track down killers, and the use of DNA didn't start until the 80s. That meant killers could commit way more crimes before they were caught. Another person interviewed on the matter said that there was more to it. You had public fascination with killers, and this may have inspired more of them. Then, in the book Sons of Cain, A History of Serial Killers, it's written that World War II had something to do with it. Some of the children of those soldiers lived with fathers that had experienced the worst kind of savagery that the world has ever seen, and that, according to the book, may have had a profound effect on how a few of those kids grew up. You had this trauma everywhere, and with it came the breakdown of some families. But the book adds something else. We might see a rise of serial killers again from this generation. Why is that? Well, it's complicated. In the book we just talked about, the writer says that recent times killers might create a generation that contains more serial killers than ever before. He writes that serial killers are monstrous, misshapen reflections in a distorted mirror to human civilization. They are kids that grew up watching terror alerts on TV, kids that grew up looking at X-rated videos that showed the aftermath of such terror, kids that are not even shocked by bloody content they can easily see on the internet. While people born in the 70s and 80s and 90s can see that too, they didn't have it on their doorstep, so to speak, all their lives. Such content has been normalized. The same author is interviewed by Psychology Today. In that interview, he talks about the rise of crime novels and pulp fiction in the 50s being some inspiration for serial killers. It might not have made them go out the door and start killing, but as Psychology Today writes, it probably created pubescent rehearsal fantasies. Now with crime fiction turning into real crime that can be seen anytime on the internet, the author believes, we may easily be facing another viral pandemic of serial killing. He believes this new wave will come when the new generation grow up to the age that most men start killing, usually late 20s or early 30s. Some kids of today might turn ugly in the early 2030s. Another crime expert said this in 2018, "We're raising a generation of killers because we're raising kids to kill since they are really little." What did he mean? In his book Inside the Mind of a Killer, he writes that kids are exposed to violence from childhood, on the internet, but also movies that involve some pretty insane torture scenes. He adds to that video games that have become so realistic you might believe in the actions you are doing. He says that if you take this fascination with virtually slaughtering people and add it to a broken home, with perhaps school bullying and the availability of guns, you might be looking at more kids going on wild killing rampages. He believes things such as school shootings are only going to get much worse. But is there any hard evidence that very violent video games actually make the players more violent or have violent fantasies? A 2014 study published in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin did indeed say those playing violent games may become more aggressive because of it. But this is still a hot potato of a topic, and there's still no substantiated evidence that playing such games directly leads to extreme violence. We may know more later. Nonetheless, if you look hard enough, you can find some crimes which could have been said to have been partly inspired by games. You might look at the case of young killer Devin Moore, who is currently on death row in the US. His lawyer said the game Grand Theft Auto Vice City was partly responsible for the kid's shooting spree. Moore even once said, "Life is a video game, you've got to die sometime." There are some other cases, but we may be skeptical regarding if the games really were such a big influence behind the crimes. But it's not just exposure to violence, as we've said, it's the era kids grow up in. If there is familial discord, there may be more kids with problems when they reach adulthood. We might look at children born to families that grew up with World War II and the Great Depression. Those kids, when older, were part of what's called the golden age of serial killers. Now we might look at families that grew up with conflicts in the Middle East and the financial collapse. If there have been difficulties and these kids have also been exposed to violence, well, we guess that's why some people might believe we might again see a rise in serial killers. Before you get too worried, of course, this forecast may not happen. In fact, if you look at the database created by Mike Amont, a professor at Radford University in Virginia, he says that there's no doubt been a reduction in serial killers and the number of victims serial killers get away with killing. He told The Guardian in 2018, "I'm careful to say there has been a decline in the number of serial killers we can identify. There could be thousands of serial killers that we don't know about and for some reason we're not identifying today as well as we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. He did add, though, that even if people wanted to kill serially, it would be much harder with improved law enforcement, omnipresent cameras, and the fact that people have changed their habits and don't usually head out into highways hitching cars without anyone knowing about it. This, of course, doesn't mean that there will be fewer people with the urge to kill. just that it will be harder to get away with it. Perhaps we'll see more mass shootings and fewer people going on to kill again and again. The author of the book we discussed told the New York Post that once these killers are caught, we might well hear them tell this kind of story. "We were living as a family in a home, and come 2008, my dad committed suicide. My dad lost his job. He became a drug addict. He was an alcoholic. He was never the same. He lost his pride, and I lost my dad." Do you think that's going too far? Have things really been that bad that we're going to see more killers in the future? Is exposure to violence on the internet and in games really such a big deal? When people are deciding what age to have children at, you'll often hear them say that before they have kids, there are a lot of things they want to get done first. Maybe travel the world, maybe concentrate on a career, or at least just wait until the 20s are out of the way. On the flip side, some people will tell you that they want to have children at a young enough age so that they can actively play sports with their children when kids are in their teens, adding that they don't want to be aging parents because they fear they won't have the energy required, say in their 50s, to be still dealing with kids. Today, we'll talk about all the pros and cons in this episode of the Infographic Show. Is it better to be born to younger or older parents? As we just pointed out, there are many reasons why people choose to be younger or older parents. Sometimes kids just happen, of course, but often parenting is meticulously planned. So let's say you were born to older parents. What does older mean? Well, for women, having a kid over the age of 35 could said to qualify the woman as being an older parent. As for men, they can keep on giving well into old age, but that doesn't mean they should do that. Before we talk about the kids, we should say that science doesn't seem to disagree that the longer a woman waits, there could be more birth complications for her and the kid. The U.S. National Institutes of Health tells us that in older age, women are more at risk of having a stillbirth, miscarriage, or ectopic pregnancy. That means the baby being in an abnormal position. The woman also has more chances of having high blood pressure during her pregnancy, higher cholesterol, developing diabetes, and according to the American Stroke Association, if women are over 40 after getting pregnant, they are more at risk of having a stroke or a heart attack. There are more risks and they are well documented. It seems if a woman gives birth at a later age, perhaps 35 or 40, there is more chance of the baby being born with Down syndrome. We're also told that there's a risk of other congenital anomalies when women have kids at a later age. Other studies tell us that kids also have more of a chance of developing neuropsychiatric disorders, such as autism or even schizophrenia. This all sounds grim, but the American Journal of Epidemiology said that this has more to do with the health of the woman, her lifestyle, than it does with the age alone. Many critics will tell you that there's a bit of scaremongering going on to compel women not to wait too long. Now for some good news for older mothers. As you can imagine, having a teenage parent might not always be the best thing in the world. Often the woman has not matured enough in life to be an able parent. While there's always the risk of the mother and perhaps the father if he's too young too, just not being ready, there's also money to consider, as a younger mother and father might not be financially prepared to have a child. There are many other benefits of having children at a later age. One Danish study that seems to be cited a lot found that kids born to older parents had fewer emotional and behavioral problems than kids born to younger parents. But these were kids studied at age 7 and 11. It seems at age 15 things leveled out. It gets better for older parents. Another study undertaken in the UK and US found that kids born to older mothers and fathers on average had a higher IQ than kids born to younger parents. That study found the kids had more success in education, especially when it came to subjects that fall into the STEM category, meaning science, technology, engineering, and math. Another study called The Relationship Between Maternal Education and Children's Academic Outcomes found that kids born to older parents have more chance of developing good vocabularies, being able to articulate themselves better, which has nothing to do with biology but the fact that often older parents often have a richer vocabulary, and this is passed on to the kids. In fact, as Psychology Today tells us, older parents are on average more educated than younger parents, whether formally or informally, and this affects how well the kids do in school. The kids of older parents in general outshone kids in education, but you can add this to the fact that in general the kids of older parents spent more meaningful time with their parents, since those parents had more time to give. Younger parents to some extent are still either working very hard or perhaps haven't grown up enough to dedicate all their time to their kids. Another bonus, according to a study in the Menopause Journal anyway, is mothers who had their kids later in life had more chance of living to a very old age. It seems because older mothers had waited until the ideal time. They were able to take better care of themselves prior to having kids. It didn't seem to affect how much longer men lived, or at least the study didn't mention that. One doctor also noted, this does not mean women should wait to have children at older ages in order to improve their own chances of living longer. The advantages of being an older parent are listed in many other studies. That Danish study we mentioned also said that older parents are less likely to lose their cool and start shouting and screaming at their kids, which is good if you're an older parent, but also good for the child's well-being. A 2012 study published in the British Medical Journal said that the young kids they looked at born to older parents had lots of advantages. Some of these were a better body mass index, advanced language capabilities, advanced social development, and these kids were even less likely to be admitted to the hospital. It seems older parents were more adept than younger parents at keeping their kids away from actions that resulted in injuries. Again, there are lots of studies out there that will tell you that older parents have more risk of producing a child that has birth defects, physical or psychological, and this is solely related to chromosomal abnormalities. But as we pointed out, there seems to be lots of benefits for the parent and child if the parent is older. We must also remember that many other factors will affect the child's development, such as being born with one or two parents and how financially well off the parents are. Not all young kids are born to struggling parents. Kids might be born to older parents that leave them with a nanny all the time and spoil them rotten at other times, which isn't necessarily good for the child. Okay, so now let's look at some of the benefits of being a younger parent for both parent and child. Unfortunately, there seems to be less scientific research on this than there is anecdotal reportage. Those benefits include young parents not having to deal with a tricky transition later in life. Older parents might have gotten a little bit too used to their lifestyle. Some reports suggest that younger parents might be able to relate better to their kids. They might understand their teenage culture, and so in times of difficulties be able to offer more sound advice. They will likely still have a lot of energy too, which means being able to do more things with their kids, including dads going to the park and playing sports, at least with vigor. But perhaps one of the biggest reasons to have kids early in life is to free up some time in the later age. This is how one parent put it. While other parents who decided to have kids later in life will be busy chasing toddlers or managing the mood swings of preteens, I'll be busy rekindling my dreams and pursuing my passions and traveling. There might also be active grandparents around who are still young enough to get in on the act of bringing up the kids, while kids with older parents might miss out on hanging out with the old folks. Life Science cited a study involving lots of parents, although the study, conducted by the University of California, unfortunately only included parents that had good incomes and were white. It wanted to know what the ideal age to have kids was. From that study, it was revealed that being an older parent was better in various ways, but the main reason was that the parents seemed to be more emotionally prepared for the task of parenting. Older parents in general had more freedom from work, more money, and more time for their kids. Saying that, many women in the study also said that they would have ideally had kids earlier in life if they had the money. They basically didn't have kids at a young age because they didn't feel financially prepared. Moreover, a third of the women in the study and a quarter of the men, who all had kids late, said they felt they didn't have the right amount of energy for their kids. It's complicated though, and some studies suggest that there's a sweet spot in age to have children. The U.S. National Institutes of Health wrote in 2012, "We find that offspring born to mothers younger than age 25 or older than 35 have worse outcomes with respect to mortality, self-rated health, height, obesity, and the number of diagnosed conditions than those born to mothers aged 25 to 34. Perhaps, as we said, younger mothers and fathers might not be the best prepared, and perhaps if mothers are over 35, as the study says, there might be more chance of birth defects related to what it calls the mother's fecundity or lack thereof. There are so many studies out there though, and not all are equal. You may have seen the British tabloid headline saying older dads made uglier kids if the dads were over 40. But if you look closely at that study, it's hardly science-based. In fact, it's not reliable at all.
There is one thing that's inevitable: death. Someday you'll breathe your final breath before kicking the proverbial bucket. How much time you have is anyone's guess, so it's important to make the most of life. Live it to the fullest, do all the things you dream to do, and exit the world with no regrets. But then most of us go about our day as if we'll live forever, putting off what's really important until tomorrow. Today we'll be looking at those things we never got around to doing in this episode of the Infographic Show, 10 things old people say they regret not doing in their life. Steve Jobs was a visionary who left his mark on the world. His company Apple revolutionized the personal computing world with the invention of the Mac, changed the way we listen to music with the launch of the iPod, and connected the world when the first iPhone was released. Jobs himself was known for his energetic approach to life, inspiring people with his motivational speeches. Did he have any regrets? You would think not, and his attitude towards death hints that he likely had none. On his deathbed, Jobs looked at his sister Patty, then at his children, then at his life partner Laureen, and then over their shoulders past them before uttering his final words, "Oh wow, oh wow, oh wow." His sister, Mona Simpson, described his tone as affectionate, dear, and loving. Though Jobs left the world early, at the age of 56, it certainly seems that he did so without regret. But then, Steve Jobs is not your everyday kind of person. He led an extraordinary life. What about those of us who will pass away without feeling that we have properly completed the journey? It seems that many of the regrets people have are the same. Looking at what the media says, and the real-life experiences of doctors and nurses who spend time with old people at the end of their life, here are the top 10 most common regrets that we came across. Number 10. I wish I had learned a second language. Somewhat surprisingly, many people depart the world wishing they had learned a second language. Maybe they feel they would have been able to connect with more people in life if they spoke more than one language, or that travel to other countries and mixing with different cultures would have been easier. It could also be that learning languages used to be much harder than it is today, with heaps of internet resources, online classes, and language apps, so this regret should not exist for much longer, as you really don't have any excuses for not following through and learning a language if that's something you wish to do. Number 9. I wish I hadn't worked so hard. Bronnie Ware is an Australian nurse who spent several years working in palliative care, caring for patients in the last 12 weeks of their lives. She was quoted in British newspaper The Guardian saying that this regret came from every male patient she had nursed. Because of working so hard, many people felt that they missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. Some women also spoke of this regret, but as most of the people she nursed were from an older generation, when women tended to spend their lives at home, running the house and being mothers, this regret was much more common with men. That's now changed, of course, so it's likely that in the future, this regret will be high on the list for both men and women. Number 8. I wish I had been better at expressing how I felt. Bronnie also said that many of her patients expressed regret that they suppressed their feelings in order to keep peace with others. Because of this, they never accomplished the things they wanted to. Some of her patients even developed illnesses due to the bitterness they carried around as a result of hiding their true feelings. Dr. Barton Goldsmith, who writes for online magazine Psychology Today, says that when you express how you feel, problems get solved, relationship issues get resolved, and life is easier. You will also enjoy your life more because you're not holding on to unhealed or confusing feelings. Number 7. I wish I had taken better care of my body. If you don't look after your body, your time to leave will come much faster, so it's no surprise that many people express this regret on their deathbed. Obesity, smoking, or excessive drinking can all drive you to an early death. Most things in life can be replaced, a new car or a new house, but you can't nip down to the shop and buy a new replacement body. So if this is one regret you think you might have when your time is up, it's probably better to make some changes today. Number 6. I wish I had been more selective with my romantic relationships. One of the most common fears that people have in life is never meeting their soulmate, the person they are meant to spend the rest of their life with. And of course this can show up when death is near, with the regret that life was spent with the wrong lover. Maybe a person has been in a toxic or abusive relationship, or they walked away from the person they were meant to be with. Many stay in relationships because they worry they may end up alone at the end of life, but when they do reach the end, some of these people are suddenly faced with regret that the romantic choices they made may have been incorrect. So if you think you're in this zone, maybe now is the time to get back to swiping on Tinder so you have no regrets in later life. Number 5. I didn't need to worry so much. Carl Pillermer, a professor of human development at Cornell University and the author of 30 Lessons for Living, Tried and True Advice from the Wisest Americans, spoke to nearly 1,500 elderly people asking them one simple question. What are the most important lessons you have learned over the course of your life? One of the most common responses he received was people saying they wish they had not worried so much. One example is John Alonzo, an 83-year-old man who had been a construction worker and who had battled a lifetime of financial insecurity. But he didn't think twice in giving this advice. Don't believe that worrying will solve or help anything. It won't. So stop it. That was it. His one life lesson was simply to stop worrying. Number 4. I wish I had spent more time outside of my comfort zone. To quote Albert Einstein, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. And if you spend a life doing the same thing over and over, waiting for something exciting to happen, then it probably won't. Exciting things happen when you get out there and make them happen. But it's often easier said than done, and many of us stick close to comfort in the hope of an easier life. So when you reach the end and you're looking back on it as a whole, you'll be much more proud if you can say that the most unease you felt was that day you went skydiving, not the time you had to choose whether to eat meat or fish at dinner. Number 3, I could have given back more. Most of us will wait until the bank account is stacked up with cash before deciding to give a few dollars to the local charity, but it seems people find themselves on their deathbed regretting that they didn't give more. Giving doesn't need to be about money though. More often it's about helping and supporting others with what you can offer as a human being and expecting nothing in return. Maybe you have useful skills, or sometimes just a listening ear. Imagine you're attending your own funeral, and you hear a friend giving your eulogy. What would you want them to be saying? Most likely you would want to hear them talk about what a great person you were, and how you had an impact on their life. There's only one way to ensure you get a eulogy of this kind, and that's by giving back and by helping others. Number 2, I wish I pursued my dreams and aspirations and not the life others expected of me. One of the most common regrets we found was this one. People who had arrived at the end of their life and had missed out on many of their heart's desires because they were too busy living up to what others expected of them. Our nurse Bronnie Ware said that most people had not honored even half of their dreams and had to die knowing that it was due to choices they had made or not made because of how others might judge them. There is a freedom that comes with being close to death, but often that freedom is also when you realize the things you missed out on. So if you have things you feel you should be doing, today, not tomorrow, is when to act. And finally, number 1, I wish I had spent more time with people I care about. Many of us get caught up in the daily activities of life. Working, shopping, raising the kids, holidays. It's hard not to be consumed by the endless cycle. But then, later in life, we're faced with not having spent enough quality time with friends and family. With all the research we looked at online, this is the most common regret. Everyone misses their friends and family when they reach the end, and they start to regret not spending more time with them in life. It can also work in reverse, where the people who are left behind also feel the regret. In 2014, when President Obama spoke at a town hall meeting at Malaya University in Kuala Lumpur, he said, "I regret not having spent more time with my mother. She died early. She got cancer right around when she was my age. Actually, she was just a year older than I am now. It happened very fast in about 6 months." Obama's mother, Ann Dunham, died in 1995 of ovarian cancer at age 52 when Obama was 34.
You may think you're doing great, but how do your achievements compare to others your age? Have you peaked too early? Or are you way ahead in the game of life? Let's find out. Besides getting rid of acne, there is one thing on every teen's mind: getting a driver's license. Depending on where you live, this can happen between the ages of 16 and 18. So if you haven't gotten your driver's license by the time you're 18, you're falling behind. In recent years, more than 60% of people receive their driver's license in their teenage years. That's around 13 million teens in the US alone. Now, based on where you live and life circumstances, you may not have the opportunity to get a license, but it's definitely something you should consider doing as soon as possible, because having a driver's license allows for freedom from the parental units. No matter who you are, as a teen, you need to do this next thing. Your future could literally depend on it. 18-year-olds have an opportunity and duty to register to vote. If you don't like the way your town, state, or country is being run, you have no right to complain about it if you don't register to vote. Each year, more and more 18-year-olds register to vote, with 2020 being the highest turnout for teenage voters this century. If you're not registered to vote in your late teens, you are quickly losing points against others in your age group. If you don't register to vote, you can't be upset with how elections turn out, so what are you waiting for? As a teenager, you probably have heard of another important responsibility that's expected of you: getting a job. In 2021, around 50% of teenagers started working their first, second, or even third jobs. And although this is only half of the eligible teenage population, those with jobs, even something as menial as working the register at a fast food joint, still have a leg up on other teenagers who have never worked a day in their life. So if you're still receiving an allowance from mom and dad, it might be time to join the other teens who have taken the leap into the world of making their own money. One last thing you should do in your teenage years is to open a bank account and get a credit card. Whether you like it or not, you need to have money in order to survive in this world. 53% of 15-year-olds have a bank account of some sort, while around 20% have a credit card. This is often co-signed by a parent or guardian, since teenagers are a high-risk category for banks. But that's okay. If you're a teen who hasn't opened some kind of checking account or started to build credit, it is time. The sooner you get into the financial system, the sooner you can become more financially independent. Something to keep in mind is that as you grow older, money is going to play a big role in your life. If you're 21 or close to it, these next few life achievements are for you. Let's see where you stand. And if you're past this point in life, let's see if you did it right. The average yearly salary for a 21-year-old is around $30,000. This might seem high, but by 21, you should have a few things going for you. At this point, you could have been at the same job for multiple years, and if that's the case, you should be getting a raise each year. Even if you started at minimum wage, by the time you're 21, it's time to either ask your boss for more money or find a higher paying job. Like most people your age, you're either in college or at least have a few college courses under your belt. But what else should you have achieved by the age of 21? Well, for one thing, you're now of legal drinking age, so maybe you could grab a drink. Over 3/4 of Americans have had a drink before the age of 21. We are not condoning underage drinking by any means, but if you're 21 and haven't tried your first alcoholic beverage yet, you're part of the minority. This next achievement for a 21-year-old might seem like a no-brainer, but the amount of 21-year-olds who still don't make their own doctor's appointments is staggering. The vast majority of 21-year-olds still have their dentist, optometrist, and doctor's appointments made by their parents. If you really want to be a high-achieving 21-year-old, you should be making your own appointments. Most pediatricians stop seeing patients when they become 18. However, some may keep you on until you're 21. If you're too old for a pediatrician, you're definitely too old to have someone else schedule your doctor's appointments. Technically, you can stay on your parents' health insurance until you're 26, but there's no minimum age to make your own appointments. And if you're a 21-year-old who wants to really be far ahead of your peers, you need to accomplish this next achievement. Over 52% of people around 21 years of age still live with their parents. If you're going to be a high achiever, you should have your own place, pay your own rent, and maintain a somewhat clean apartment by the age of 21. It's not an unrealistic goal to have, and something worth considering if you are 21 or older. We're now going to leap into the next decade. What should you have accomplished by age 30 that everyone else has? Well, this is when most people start considering themselves adults, so let's see how grown up you are. If you're currently 30 or close to it, think about how much money you make each year. Is it more than $41,000? If so, you're doing better than the average 30-year-old. To be fair, salary is highly dependent on where you live. For example, someone who lives in a small town in Texas is most likely going to make a lot less money than someone who lives in New York City. But the cost of living in the big city will almost certainly be much higher. There's something much more important than salary that every 30-year-old should have. If you're 30 and have not started a retirement account, you are definitely behind. But don't worry, there's still time. Think of it this way, you can start your own retirement account at any point, regardless of what job you have. Many of these accounts have a return of around 7%. If you start a retirement account right now at the age of 30, put $3,000 in it a year for 10 years, and then stop contributing at the age of 40, by the time you're 70 years old, you'll have close to $340,000 in the retirement account. That's a good chunk of change. So as soon as you're done with this video, you'll probably want to get started on that. Surprisingly, this next life achievement may be something that we thought was more common than it actually is. If you have a bachelor's degree by the time you're 30, you're one of the 37% of people your age that have accomplished this achievement. This means that over 60% of all 30-year-olds have not yet received an undergraduate degree. In terms of life achievements, this puts you way ahead of other members of your age bracket when searching for a job. But everyone also seems to have a side hustle. 64% of 30-year-olds report that they have a side gig or another way of making income than their regular job. If you're making around $10,000 a year just on your side hustle alone, you're about average for a 30-year-old. So although around 60% of people who are 30 do not have a college degree, that same percentage seems to be making a good chunk of change doing other things on the side. One of the main achievements in life that ushers someone into adulthood is getting married. If you are 30 and not yet married, don't worry too much. However, since the average age of marriage is 32, it may be time to start thinking about buying a ring for that special someone. At the age of 40, you're probably cruising. You're in a sweet spot in your career and hopefully you're working someplace that makes you happy. This means you're making around $52,000 a year, you're on par with your age bracket. However, if you're making less than that and are miserable at your job, it may be time for a midlife crisis. Some benchmarks for being 40 have to do with loans and a family. It's around this age that the average American family has finally paid off their student loan debt. This is quite the achievement, as getting a college degree is not cheap. It takes on average 18 and a half years to pay off student loans, so if you did this before you turned 40, you're ahead of the game. And it's a good thing too, because the next life achievement is not cheap either. At the age of 40, most people have started a family, or are very close to starting one. Around 86% of women are mothers by the time they're 40, and more than 60% of men were fathers by that age as well. If you don't have kids by the age of 40, you're in the minority, which might not be a bad thing depending on the lifestyle you want to live. By 50, the end of work might be in sight for you. Or perhaps you're so in love with what you do that you never want to stop. Either way, the average salary for someone who is 50 years old is around $50,000 a year. But many 50-year-olds report finding happiness in things other than money. This is a common point in life to start mentoring others. Maybe it's someone at work or through volunteer work. At 50 years old, you have learned a lot about life, so why not share it with someone else? It's also normal at this age to have all the debts and loans paid off. Most people who are 50 have paid off the mortgage on their house. If you still have massive amounts of credit debt or loans at this age, you might be working longer than some of those other people in your age bracket. Again, everyone's different and has different life circumstances, but most people who have planned ahead find themselves all caught up on bills, or relatively close to it by the age of 50. However, it's in the next age that many life achievements are reached, and the living gets good. At age 65, things can begin to shift. Whether it's your personal choice or your body's choice, you just can't work as much anymore. This is why certain programs were set up for people in this age to take advantage of, and why retirement normally occurs for people around the age of 65. For your entire career, you've been paying into Social Security and the Medicare system, and now you finally have the chance to reap the benefits. At 65, you're eligible for Medicare, which may not be the best insurance out there, but since you've been paying into it since your first job, you might as well take advantage of it. Also, at 65, many people start planning for Social Security, which you'll be eligible for the following year. It is at 66 that you've reached full retirement age in the eyes of the government, and you can collect your benefits without penalty. So, if you are 65 and not starting to collect on the benefits you've contributed to your whole life, you should most definitely look into that. On a more somber note, around 76% of people 65 and over have a will. This is not just because they're getting older, but because they want to ensure their final wishes are carried out, and their assets and money go to the right place, whether that be family, friends, or into a trust. Regardless of how you feel about retirement or getting older, 65 seems to be the time that your legal documents should be in order so you can have some kind of peace of mind. Lastly, let's talk about what achievement you've reached at the age of 80. First of all, if you're 80 and watching the infographic show video right now, we are honored. At 80 years old, you have seen and been through a lot. You've worked hard and beaten the odds because you are a couple years older than the average life expectancy. So just reaching this age is a life achievement in and of itself. There's just nothing like watching an old movie. The acting was top-notch. There were many films and genres that aren't as popular anymore, like classic westerns and musicals, and the black and white style somehow adds to the experience. It's the perfect way to spend a lazy evening at home. There's just one thing that keeps bugging you. Why does everyone in these old movies talk so weird? No matter how many old movies you watch, in all sorts of genres, you notice the same thing. You can't put your finger on it, but there's a very distinct style of speaking that you don't notice anywhere else, and you certainly don't see it in today's movies or TV, or in everyday life. The only other time you can remember hearing it is when you were over at your grandfather's house as a child. He liked to listen to the radio. No need for that newfangled television box. And the old radio drama repeats he listened to sometimes had that same odd accent. It went away at some point, but what was it, and where did it go? You can't put your finger on it, but you notice certain repeated patterns when the actors in those old films speak. They seem to drop the R's in their words, so words like winner come out as winna. On the other hand, the T's in words seem to be strongly emphasized. The vowels seem a bit softer than when you usually hear people speak, so common words come out just a little bit different. It reminds you of British accent in places, but it's not, because you've watched plenty of British films and those sound different. How widespread was the accent in the era, and where did it start? The answer can be found in the golden age of Hollywood, where movies went from being a small experimental industry to one of the most powerful forces in entertainment. From the 1890s to the 1920s, film was largely the province of those interested in visuals. The earliest films mostly centered around one stunning visual, like a rocket to the moon or a train racing right at the screen. They got longer and added complex stories, but they were still silent films where you read the dialogue on the screen as a separate soundtrack played. Then came the talkies, and everything changed. As classic films moved into the era of spoken dialogue, some of the most famous films of all time were made. The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca, Citizen Kane, It's a Wonderful Life. Just saying their name brings to mind some of the most distinct dialogue from them. It's impossible to imagine these films without hearing There's No Place Like Home or Rosebud in your head. And with these iconic films came that distinctive accent spoken by some of the most famous names in Hollywood. But actors are different, and Orson Welles and Judy Garland certainly didn't have the same background, so how did they pick up the same accent? Most accents come from a distinct location, either a different country or a specific location within one. Those who live down south know that a Texas Southern accent and a Louisiana Southern accent aren't the same things. But this accent doesn't seem tied to any specific location, and it's spoken by actors from all around the country and the world in this old film. and that's because it's an accent designed to bridge the gap between the two cultures that influenced the golden age of Hollywood the most. Meet the Mid-Atlantic accent. Wait, how does that make any sense? No one lives in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean unless we're talking about the unique accent spoken by whales. And that's because this isn't a traditional accent reflecting a shared heritage. Rather, it's an accent designed to bridge the gap between an American accent and a British one. This might be the only accent in history that no one spoke unless they were taught to do so. It became popular in the first half of the 20th century, as preparatory schools around the country taught their students to speak in a specific style to appear cultured. The students were given formal public speaking training that included a song-like intonation and longer vowels, which combined to a greater resonance. This meant that sometimes words lost the sound of some of the consonants, especially R. That didn't seem to stop the accent from becoming more and more popular among the elites. So when did this accent start making its way into the world of acting? Well, by the mid-1920s, the Mid-Atlantic accent was a staple of the wealthy and educated, particularly in the northeastern United States. President of the United States Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife were the only first couple to speak in this fashion, but First Lady Jackie Kennedy would bring it back into fashion in the 60s. Prominent authors and journalists were associated with it, with the majority being educated at private schools in New England. The boarding school Groton was considered the epicenter of this trend, and as a generation of actors came out of elite schools, they brought it to Hollywood. And with them came a sea of change in the way actors spoke. Traditionally, actors in the United States trained in imitating upper-class British accents. That's because they were primarily training for stage plays, with the most popular including the classic dramas of William Shakespeare and the mysteries of Agatha Christie. These perennials were set firmly in the world of London's upper class or the royal courts of bygone eras. Then came the silent films, and that allowed actors with very different voices to find a place in the pictures. No one cared what Charlie Chaplin's voice sounded like when he was defined by his inventive pantomime routines. Then came a woman named Edith Warman Skinner. A famous vocal coach, she was a student of linguist William Tilley and the author of a famous book called Speak with Distinction. She had studied the Mid-Atlantic accent herself and called it Good American Speech. Her book became a required reading in many theatrical training programs, and soon aspiring actors were adopting this distinctive pronunciation. She believed it was the appropriate way to speak in what she described as classic and elevated texts. Goodbye British accent. She went on to teach at the Carnegie Institute of Technology and later at Juilliard, where countless of the world's most famous actors graduated, all sounding the same. But did the technology of early films and radio have anything to do with how odd these actors sound? It's a chicken and the egg question, but the earliest days of radio and talkies had a problem with fully replicating the full range of human speech. The human bass tones couldn't be conveyed fully, which led to voices sounding much more nasally and clipped. These are traits already found in the Mid-Atlantic accent, so when you watch an old film or listen to a recorded program on the radio from the era, these traits might be magnified by the sound quality. So how did this northeastern speaking style make its way all across the country to Hollywood? And that's because the American movie industry didn't start out in Hollywood. California was still up and coming in the early 1900s, while New York and Philadelphia were industry powerhouses. So most of the actors initially came out of the Northeast before the studios packed up and headed off to Los Angeles in the 1910s. It wasn't until they shifted to the talkies that people ever heard an actor's voice off a live stage, and they were surprised to hear that they all talked the same way. If there was a legendary actor of the era, they probably had this accent. Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, Cary Grant, even horror master Vincent Price all spoke in this style. For a long time, it seemed to be everywhere, and then it wasn't. Where did the Mid-Atlantic accent go? Hollywood continued to encourage actors to learn this accent into the 40s, but then the focus of Hollywood started to shift. Sound improved, and actors were better able to get across their natural bass. Directors started focusing on more authentic films, telling stories from around the world, and having their actors learn authentic accents from those regions. No longer would a cowboy roaming the Texas border sound like he had just come from crew practice at a Boston boarding school. The decline started at the end of World War II, and increased immigration to the United States and a more diverse population led to the more distinctive American accents that we all know today. The world was less defined by our connection to the United Kingdom, and an accent that bridged the gap wasn't necessary. So, did the Mid-Atlantic accent simply fade away? Well, yes and no. While it's not traditionally taught as a critical part of vocal training for all actors now, you can still learn it from many of the top vocal coaches and at prominent acting schools. That's because the golden age of Hollywood and the era that surrounds it are now a part of American history, and that means only one thing in Hollywood: it's time to make movies about that era. Hollywood prides itself on historical accuracy now like never before, with a big push for accurate casting and directors often consulting with historians while making their films. They want everything to fit the time period, including the way actors speak. The accent stayed for certain characters even after it fell out of use in the 1950s and 1960s, mostly for characters who were supposed to be stuffy upper-crust New Englanders. Soon enough, the accent went from a sign of elites to a sign of comedy characters. Famous characters like Thurston and Lovey Howell from Gilligan's Island or the Crane brothers from Frasier used the accent long after it was common. The most famous use of the accent, though, didn't come from the Earth at all. It was menacing galactic tyrant Darth Vader, voiced by James Earl Jones. The Imperial Overlord spoke with a deep bass voice and a mid-Atlantic accent, and it obviously worked. Can you imagine the iconic "I am your father" line being delivered with a California accent? So where does the mid-Atlantic accent show up today? Mostly in movies taking place in the era where it was popular. Netflix's new film Mank, about the creation of Citizen Kane, recreates the era faithfully down to the speaking tone of the actors and executives involved. When director Paul Thomas Anderson was making The Master, a 2012 film starring Joaquin Phoenix, Amy Adams, and the late Philip Seymour Hoffman, the notoriously detail-obsessed director wanted to immerse his viewers in the era. The late 1940s-era story, set among a New England religious cult, is considered the most accurate recreation of the mid-Atlantic accent era by film critic Richard Brody. Everyone comes off a little stiff and speaks in a specific cadence, exactly as they would have back then. So while the mid-Atlantic accent might be a thing of the past, and today's actors don't have that distinctive speaking style, the art of that style will continue to be taught. Hollywood loves movies about movies. Imagine if you aged incredibly fast, say for every year you aged 10 years. It sounds like something from a fairy tale, a magical spell put on someone by a wicked witch. But in the real world, something does indeed at least resemble this. It's known as progeria syndrome, which is just one of what are called progerioid syndromes. These are basically genetic disorders that seem to fast-forward the aging process. No doubt you've heard of two fairly common diseases that fall into this category, that affect older people, and those are Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's disease. Progeria is different, as sadly it starts manifesting at a very young age, and so by the time children are aged just a few years, they already resemble a much older person. Let's now look deeper into this. The Progeria Research Foundation tells us that the full name given to this disease is Hutchinson-Gilford progeria syndrome, named after the two people that discovered it and wrote about it in the 19th century. The first part, progeria, actually comes from Greek and means premature aging. We're told that the basis of this disorder is a faulty gene, and scientists explain that the absence of the lamin AC protein makes the nucleus of cells unstable and has the effect of very sped-up aging. This doesn't mean, of course, that the young people have the wisdom of the aged or that they're old in any way in their mind. What does happen is the body ages, meaning these people as early as 2 years old may start to have a wrinkled appearance. They lose their hair, they have stiff joints, have a high-pitched voice, a larger head, a thin nose, and unfortunately may experience all kinds of problems associated with older age, including atherosclerosis and heart disease. They might also suffer many other diseases that people don't usually get until their autumn years. These differences in physicality don't exactly mean the children age and look as if they would have if they aged normally. People with progeria often look quite alike. According to various sources, it can affect any race and occurs in both males and females across the globe at about the same frequency. You can usually tell if someone has progeria at around 18 to 24 months. The first signs might be loss of all body hair and head hair, as well as a small pinched nose, the appearance of many veins visible through the skin, and the absence of growth, including what looks like a very small face but a large head. This won't happen to many young people. With progeria, it's said to affect 1 in about 4 million people. There's no cure yet, and most of the sufferers can only expect to make it into their teens, or in very few cases perhaps the early 20s. We're told the reason for their premature death is almost always related to their heart, such as having a stroke or having a heart attack. These young kids may have some kind of heart surgery to extend their life, but no amount of medical procedures so far have managed to prevent serious heart-associated problems for very long. But what about the people suffering from it? How do they get on? One of the people who survived the longest with this disorder became something of a celebrity. His name was Leon Botha, and he lived a full life until his death aged 26. This South African man was a DJ, a hip-hop artist, a writer, photographer, and a painter. You can see him spinning on YouTube or look at some of his impressive drawings. The disease certainly didn't hold him back in an artistic way. We should stress again that progeria affects the body but not the mental faculties. In the British media in 2015, it was announced that a progeria sufferer who had captured the hearts and minds of the public had died at age just 17. Her name was Hayley O'Kines, and the press said that at the time of her death, she had the body of a 104-year-old. She'd been told she might not make it past the age of 13, but she fought on, only succumbing to pneumonia in the end. During her life, she did some amazing things, including writing her own biography called Old Before My Time. She was also featured in 2 documentary films, one called The Girl Who Was Older Than Her Mother and World's Oldest Teenager. Her father told the press that he was besotted with his little girl. As she got older, though, he noticed that she wasn't growing. At first, he thought it might not be anything, as he's a very short man. He said then at age 13 months, she was still wearing clothes for a 3-month-old, and he and his wife knew something was wrong. She was then diagnosed with this unusual illness. It didn't hold the girl back, though, and she fulfilled a few dreams by traveling around the world, swimming in the ocean with dolphins, and maybe the best of all, she got to meet her idol Justin Bieber. She also had some words with Prince Charles and Kylie Minogue. Another well-known sufferer was named Sam Burns. You may have seen him when he did one of his TEDx talks. You can see quite clearly that the disease has no effect on how articulate he is. He said if he wanted anyone to know anything about him, it was this: I have a very happy life. He went on to say, even though there are many obstacles in my life, many of them created by progeria, I don't want people to feel bad for me. His philosophy for a happy life, he said, is that he's okay with what he can't do, because there are so many things that he can do. While he can't run a long way, he only focuses on all the things he's able to do, which are many. Like many of you, he must understand his abilities and adapt his life to knowing his boundaries, and then becoming the best at what he can do. He also said he surrounds himself with people that are good for him, and that's something he believes we all should do. They provide him with a positive influence, and he returns that back to them. His other main reason for his happiness, he said, was that he always keeps moving forward, always planning the day ahead and making the best of those days. Keep focused, he said. I try not to lose energy feeling bad for myself, he said, because when I do, I get stuck at a paradox where there's no room for any happiness or any other emotion. He died age 17. You might also have seen someone who has been called an internet superstar, having garnered much attention on platforms like YouTube. Her name is Adalia Rose, and as we speak, just one clip on YouTube featuring her has been watched almost 7 million times. At the age of 11 in 2018, she already had 170 million views on YouTube, while her Facebook account had 13 million likes. This girl from Austin, Texas said in one interview, I like to make videos for my YouTube fans because I love them, I guess. Her parents say they try not to talk too much with her about progeria, only that they treat her like any other child. She seems to live just like any other girl, with only the aging process making her look different. As we write this, one of her last videos posted on Facebook opens with the words, if you have a disease or sickness, don't be ashamed of it. Because look at my eye, she shows an eye that won't open, and I have no hair, and I just went outside. I feel ashamed, but now I'm okay. She's perhaps the biggest viral star that talks openly about a condition that has handicapped her in some way. The disease is very uncommon, as we said, with the media saying right now that about 500 children in the world have it. But will any of these kids be cured? What hope does science have of treating this disorder? You can actually go to the Progeria Research Foundation website and see the bios of many of the kids that live with the disease or have passed away. Just looking at a map of where cases found, it seems that progeria sufferers are spread all over the world quite evenly. You can find Megan from the USA, a teenager that is an athlete, an author, a poet, and a musician. You've got 23-year-old Sammy from Italy, a budding actor and painter who's been on TV in Italy many times. Over in Australia, there's Enzo, whose mother says he enjoys anything with wheels, from playing Mario Kart to riding motorcycles. In Belgium, a brother and sister both have progeria. Michiel, who is 20, and his sister Amber, who is 12. They have a multilingual website which details their day-to-day lives and their ongoing treatment. Yes, we say treatment because some of the people we've mentioned are taking part in trials. Doctors hope one day to reverse this fast-aging process. We are told that there have been some success stories when sufferers took the drug lonafarnib. what's called a farnesyltransferase inhibitor, during medical trials. The drug was in the past used to treat people suffering from various kinds of cancer. But during trials, progeria sufferers experienced positive results. These results were improved bone structure, better hearing, improved weight, and best of all, the patient's blood vessels became more flexible. The reason this is very important is that stiffness of the arteries is one of the reasons for heart attack or stroke. 28 young people from 16 countries, all with progeria, took part in the trial that lasted 2.5 years. One of the doctors leading the trial said, "When we started this clinical trial, we had no idea whether any aspect of progeria would be reversible, because no one has ever conducted a clinical treatment trial for progeria before." His aim, of course, was to give people diagnosed with the condition the chance to live as long as anyone else. This is not a cure, however, and if you read journals featuring progeria, you can see that scientists are still busy trying to stop this abnormal protein that advances aging from doing its damage. We're told that there is just no way to tell if anyone will have this irregular mutation of genes, as it doesn't seem to occur in families that have had any history of the condition. It just seems to happen, albeit, as we've said, not often. The age in which you are legally considered an adult, known as the age of majority, is most commonly 18 years of age. This is thought to be the legal threshold of adulthood when you are no longer considered a minor and are now part of the majority population. You now assume control over yourself, your actions, and your decisions, thus terminating the legal control and responsibilities of your parent or guardian. A pretty sobering thought for many young folks on the brink of adulthood. So who decided that 18 should be the age of adulthood anyway? Welcome to this episode of the Infographic Show. How did 18 become the standard for adulthood? The age of majority is defined at the age at which a person is granted by law the rights and responsibilities of an adult. In the United States, 18 is the most common age of majority. Some states, however, grant majority after a person passes high school, and still others have it set even higher. Alabama and Nebraska, for instance, have the current age of majority at 19, while Mississippi is at 21. Nonetheless, the age of majority does not affect voting age, which by law is set at 18 due to the 26th Amendment to the Constitution, giving 18-year-olds the right to vote in federal, state, and local elections. Let's just cover a few bases before we dive right into how 18 became the legal age of adulthood. There are a couple of terms that sound similar to the age of majority or the legal age of adulthood that you should know. The first one is the age of consent, which, like the age of majority, varies by state. As you already know, the age of majority means that you are now legally considered an adult. You are granted the rights and responsibilities of adulthood, like opening a bank account, purchasing a car, renting an apartment, buying a lotto ticket, and lots of other fun and legally contracting things. With that right comes great responsibility. You now also get to be held legally accountable for your actions. That's a lot of pressure for someone who's just out of high school, but it's a real eye-opener. Welcome to the real world, kid. The age of consent refers to the legally defined age in which a person is no longer required to obtain consent from a parent or guardian to get married. It also refers to the age at which a person is considered to have the capacity to voluntarily agree to sex. With consent, of course. Though sexual intercourse with a person under the age of consent will likely lead to criminal charges of statutory rape or sexual assault. So make sure you always know how old the person you're about to get down with actually is. Another term confused with the age of majority is the age of license. Like we mentioned before, the age of majority is the age at which a person is legally recognized as an adult. The age of license, however, is the age at which a government grants a person license or permission to engage in certain activities, like buying and consuming alcohol and tobacco, or if it's legally sold in your state, cannabis products. It also includes driving a motor vehicle and entering into certain kinds of contracts, like renting a car. In some cases, the age of license is even different than the age of majority. For example, you can get your driver's license at 16 even though the age of majority is 18. Or you can be the age of majority but not allowed to legally buy or consume alcohol until reaching the age of license, which is, of course, 21. But what if you decide that you want to be on your own before you reach the age of 18? This would require a legal process called emancipation. This happens when a minor is legally emancipated by the court to automatically obtain the age of majority before their 18th birthday. They are no longer controlled by their parents or guardian, and likewise, the parents or guardian are freed of the responsibility toward the emancipated child. Most jurisdictions consider minors who marry to be automatically emancipated and have obtained the age of majority status. Alright, so now that we've covered those bases, let's get back to where all this started. During World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt lowered the minimum age for the military to draft to 18, even though the voting age had historically been 21. This outraged many and a rally cry was born, "Old enough to fight, old enough to vote," became the slogan of the youth voting rights movement. In 1942, the slogan prompted Democratic Congressman Jennings Randolph from West Virginia to introduce federal legislation to lower the voting age to 18. It was Randolph's faith in America's youth that really drove this effort. He said, "They possess a great social conscience, are perplexed by the injustices in this world, and are anxious to rectify those ills." And in 1943, Georgia became the first state to lower its voting age to 18. Presidents Dwight D. Eisenhower and Lyndon B. Johnson both greatly supported Randolph's cause. Eisenhower was the first president to publicly voice his support for a constitutional amendment that would lower the voting age. In his 1954 State of the Union address, he said, "For years our citizens between the ages of 18 and 21 have, in times of peril, been summoned to fight for America. They should participate in the more political process that produces this fateful summons." In the late 1960s, with the U.S. involved in the long and costly Vietnam War, youth voting rights activists held marches and demonstrations, demanding the attention of lawmakers to the injustice and hypocrisy of drafting young men who were denied the right to vote. In 1969, 60 resolutions were introduced into Congress that would lower the voting age to 18, but none of those resolutions ever came to anything. In 1970, Congress passed a bill that extended and amended the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices. The new bill contained a provision that lowered the voting age to 18 in federal, state, and local elections. President Richard M. Nixon signed the bill into law, though he issued a public statement declaring the provision to be unconstitutional. He said, "Although I strongly favor the 18-year-old vote, I believe, along with most of the nation's leading constitutional scholars, that Congress has no power to enact it by simple stature, but rather it requires a constitutional amendment." In the 1970 case of Oregon versus Mitchell, the U.S. Supreme Court was tasked with reviewing the constitutionality of the provision. A divided Supreme Court ruled that Congress had the authority to lower the voting age in federal elections, but lacked the power to do so for state and local elections. Under this verdict, 18 to 20-year-olds were now eligible to vote for president and vice president, but not eligible to vote for state officials in the same election. Naturally, this outraged many, resulting in large public demonstrations, led by the youth who were being drafted but not allowed the right to vote. This was the groundwork that paved the way for a constitutional amendment. Congress proposed the 26th Amendment, which provides the right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of age. On March 10, 1971, the U.S. Senate voted unanimously in favor of the proposed amendment. After an overwhelmingly in favor House vote on March 23rd, the 26th Amendment went to the states for ratification. In less than 4 months, the necessary 3/4 of state legislature ratified the 26th Amendment, making it the shortest ratification period of any constitutional amendment. President Nixon signed it into law that July. At a White House ceremony attended by 500 newly eligible voters, Nixon said, "The reason I believe that your generation, the 11 million new voters, will do so much for America is that you will infuse into this nation some idealism, some courage, some stamina, and some high moral purpose that this country always needs." The Senate report accompanying the 26th Amendment states that it was proposed for 3 main reasons. First, younger citizens are fully mature enough to vote. Most people between the ages of 18 and 21 had finished high school and had received some sort of higher education. Secondly, 18-year-olds bear all or most of an adult's responsibilities. This consideration was especially important since more than 11,000 Americans killed in Vietnam were under the age of 20. Third, young voters should be given the opportunity to influence our society in a peaceful and constructive manner. Excluding 18-year-olds from the political process resulted in violent protests against the government. A central tenet of attachment theory is that a person's relationships in adulthood stem from a history of attachment, dating back to our earliest relationship. That is, the bond we formed with our mother, father, or other caretaker after birth. Our first relationship is often thought to set the stage for future relationships as we grow and move forward. So then, does this mean that if you experienced bad relationships in childhood, that you're doomed to have continued terrible relationships throughout life? There exist different theories of thought regarding this, of which we'll examine in order to best answer this question. First, we must look at it from the very beginning, starting with the first relationship we've ever had. At birth, we immediately recognize our mother's scent and the sound of her voice from being inside the womb. It's a familiar welcome into a new, unfamiliar world of life. So from this point, how do our first attachments evolve? In 1964, Rudolph Schaefer and Peggy Emerson studied 60 babies for the first 18 months of life. In order to uncover the answer to this question, they examined factors such as separation anxiety, stranger anxiety, and social referencing, or the extent that a child looks to their caretaker to check how they should respond to something new. They found that a baby's attachments develop in 4 stages. From birth until 6 weeks of age, a baby is thought to be asocial, meaning that they will react and smile to different stimuli, whether it be social or non-social. For instance, they might smile at a toy just as much as they'd smile at their mother. From 6 weeks to 7 months of age, infants go through the indiscriminate attachment phase. They prefer human company, though most will respond equally to any caregiver. After 3 months old, babies will start preferring familiar faces over unfamiliar ones. Specific attachment starts from 7 to 9 months of life. This is when babies start having a strong preference for a single attachment figure, such as a mom. The baby looks to the mother for security, comfort, and protection. It's during this time when babies become uncomfortable around strangers and cry when separated from their mothers. Some will express more anxiety than others. Nevertheless, the presence of separation anxiety is evidence that an attachment has been formed. This initial attachment usually fully develops by the baby's first year. Strongly attached babies tend to have mothers who respond quickly to their demands, whereas weakly attached babies have mothers who fail to interact. Finally, multiple attachments begin to form at 10 months onward, when babies gradually grow more independent and form relationships with more than just the mother, including other people and family members. Psychologist Erik Erikson developed his theory of psychosocial development, which discussed potential conflicts that can erupt during this time in life. According to Erikson, from birth until the first year, we go through a stage of life known as trust versus mistrust. As infants, we need to be able to trust that our caregivers will be there to provide us with our basic needs. If our needs go unfulfilled, we may grow up to be suspicious and mistrustful. Erikson formulated a total of 8 stages, but for the sake of not wanting to overwhelm or bore you with too many theorist stages, we won't go into that now. Instead, we'll discuss monkeys, rhesus monkeys to be exact. At one point, behaviorists believed that babies formed an attachment to whoever fed them. Food was thought to be the basis for an infant's love. This was disrupted by Harry Harlow's study of rhesus monkeys in the 1950s and 60s. He separated baby rhesus monkeys from their mothers to examine their attachment styles in different ways. By today's standards, this study would of course be considered highly unethical, but it was groundbreaking for the time. It taught us a lot about the primary motivating factor behind attachment. Harlow placed the baby rhesus monkeys in cages with 2 surrogate mothers, one that provided food but was made of wire, and another covered in soft, comfortable cloth. The results of the experiment showed that the monkeys preferred and spent most of their time with the comfortable mother, even though it did not provide them milk. The monkeys only went to the wire mother when hungry, then quickly returned to the cloth mother. When frightened, the monkeys took refuge with the cloth mother. The experiment reaffirmed the idea that infants bond to touch and cling to a caretaker for emotional support, not just for nourishment. Overall, however, the monkeys that were separated from their mothers and had grown up with the surrogates were shown as adults to be more timid, easily bullied by other monkeys, had more difficulty with mating, and had a higher struggle interacting with other monkeys. In this way, the lack of care at a young age showed a lower quality of life for these little guys. This was mainly due to the social deprivation during critical stages of development. World War II, unfortunately, had also provided us with an abundance of information about the consequence of mother-child separation on development. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, was the first to attempt to chart the adverse effects of maternal deprivation. Many of these children had experienced mental and social problematic behaviors. Like the monkeys who grew up without a living caregiver in the preceding Harlow experiment, the orphaned children from the war experienced a lower quality of life and tended to revert inward, withdrawing into themselves for emotional comfort. Psychologist Mary Ainsworth was a student of John Bowlby. She applied his lessons and came up with categories of relationships and attachment styles. She did this by devising an experiment in the 1970s called the strange situation. This experiment observed babies in a room with their mothers and created an awkward situation for the child to examine determine the strength of the relationship with their mother. The baby would start off in the room alone with the mother. Then a stranger would enter the room and take a seat. After some time, the stranger would begin interacting with the child with the mother still in the room. When given a cue, the mother would then get up and exit the room, leaving the child alone with the stranger. The child's reactions would be monitored before the mother would return. The response was measured to determine what the type of attachment style the child had with the mother. Babies who had a secure attachment style with their mothers felt comfortable to play around the room using their mothers as a secure base as long as she was present in the room with them. When the stranger first entered, the secure baby was initially unsure but looked to the mother that it was okay and became reassured. When the stranger attempted to play with the child, the baby engaged but remained close to the mother. When the mother left the room, the baby cried and was inconsolable when the stranger tried to comfort the child. The baby was at ease once the mother returned. This type of reaction in the child showed a secure attachment style because the baby was easily reassured once the mother returned to the room and quickly returned to play. A secure attachment implies that in the home, the parents are emotionally available, perceptive, and responsive to the infant's needs. This is the best kind of attachment that's said to lead to healthy adult relationships later on in life. A securely attached child-parent relationship is said to be present in 55 to 65% of cases. So what about the rest of the population? Aside from secure attachment, Mary Ainsworth devised 3 other forms of attachment known as avoidant attachment, ambivalent attachment, and disorganized attachment. With an avoidant attachment style, in the strange situation, the baby did not use the mom as a secure base and often didn't even flinch when the mom left the room. When the mom returned, the baby acted as if she wasn't even there and just continued playing. The child was mostly indifferent to whether she was in the room or not. This style is said to be present in 20 to 30% of cases and is thought to occur when parents are emotionally unavailable in the home, unresponsive, and neglectful. The internal working model is as such: mom doesn't respond to my emotions, so I'll just try to be more independent. The infants protect themselves by dissociating contact with the normal need for connection. Emotions are more repressed using a deactivating strategy with regard to attachment. This may lead to a greater likelihood of aggression later in life. Ambivalent attachment occurs in 5 to 15% of cases. In the strange situation experiment, infants with this attachment style were more alert to the whereabouts of the mother while playing in the room. They were very clingy and became upset when she left the room. Upon mom's return, however, the baby was not comforted. Instead, the child reacted with fits of anger. In the home, this attachment style implies that the mother is inconsistently available, meaning when she is available, she's often preoccupied with something else or not completely attuned to the infant in her responses. Infants with an ambivalent attachment style are more often anxious, clingy, and demanding, which characterizes their adult relationships later in life. Finally, in the disorganized attachment style, prevalent in 20% to 40% of cases and up to 80% in situations of abuse, infants were not soothed by contact with the mother. They displayed disorganized patterns of behavior, whereby they might move toward the mother as she left the room, then away, then freeze or go into a corner. In essence, their reactions were scattered and all over the place. In the home, this attachment style is thought to stem from physical or sexual abuse histories, psychologically disturbed parents, or parents with substance abuse issues. Clearly, this kind of relationship is not functional, producing a situation of fright without a solution, whereby the caregiver is a source of danger instead of comfort. This results in a disorganized state of mind for the infant, creating difficulty with the relationship formation later in life. What the strange situation study shows us is that patterns of interaction that children have with caregivers shape their developing minds, leading to various models of relationship formations. These early bonds color our relationships throughout life by forming an initial framework to go by and build on. Insecure attachments when young tend to cause difficulty for future relationships, which may lead to overall dissatisfaction with our lives. We should mention, however, that it's possible for children to have a different attachment style with another caregiver aside from the mother, such as the father. So it's entirely possible that a child could be insecurely attached with the mother, but securely attached with the father. But attachment style may not all be entirely the fault of the parents, so if you fell into one of the 3 insecure categories, don't go blaming mom and dad just yet. An alternative theory proposed by Kagan in 1984 discusses the role that the child plays in attachment, in that the child's temperament may have different impacts on how the parents respond. This theory was supported by research from Fox in 1989, finding that babies with an easy temperament, or those who follow steady eating and sleeping routines while being accepting of new experiences, are more likely to develop secure attachment styles with their parents. This has to do with being more agreeable and therefore easier to bond with. Another temperament style known as slow to warm up up characterized those babies who took a while to get used to new experiences. Babies with this temperament style are more likely to have insecure avoided attachments. Then we have babies with a difficult temperament, who function on irregular eating and sleeping schedules while rejecting or being stubborn to new experiences. These babies are more likely to have insecure ambivalent attachments. This shows us that the attachment doesn't go one way but is instead based on a combination of both the parents and the child's behavior. So does early attachment style determine your relationships and quality of life in adulthood? If you were in one of the 3 insecure attachment styles as a child, don't fret. There are plenty of theorists who don't believe that attachment style cements your fate. There are basically 2 perspectives on whether attachment styles in early childhood are permanent or not. The prototype perspective of attachment claims that early experiences continue to play an influential role in attachment behavior throughout our lives, but the revisionist perspective provides hope for those who are insecurely attached, asserting that early representations of relationships can be modified by new experiences over time. In this second perspective, early attachment style may not necessarily reflect patterns of relationships later in life. One article by Chris Fraley explored the mathematical models of each of these 2 perspectives in a longitudinal study in order to obtain data from meta-analysis to better understand which one was more accurate. The results indicated that attachment security was moderately stable across the first 19 years of life. Fraley notes, however, that his study has many limitations, thus it may be best to interpret the findings with a certain degree of scrutiny. Teens used to spend their days working in dangerous conditions, helping out with the chores and finding their own entertainment with next to no available resources. Today, they spend most of their time either at school or in their homes eyeballing their phones or computer screens. Today, we'll discuss just what brought about these changes over the decades in this episode of The Infographic Show, the lifestyle of teenagers over a century. In the early 1900s, similarly to today, not everyone had the same lifestyle, and where and how you lived depended on income. Overall, America was becoming more urbanized with growing cities, but most families lived in the country and many were in poverty. Those in country homes would often go to the bathroom in an outhouse and lack access to running water. In contrast, the richer segment of society would have hot water, toilets, and bathrooms for their convenience. If poor families resided in the city, they might live in something called a tenement house, where several families would use the same bathroom or outhouse outdoors. Day-to-day life of teens at this time was filled with work and some play. In the 1900s, only half of those from the age of 5 to 19 went to school, and most discontinued their studies by the 8th grade. Many, starting at a relatively young age, would work instead to contribute to the family income. In fact, 18% of workers in America were younger than 16 in the year 1900. In the cities, work could be dirty and dangerous, like coal mine labor, or stressful and similarly dangerous, like factory work. City youth would also sell newspapers or shine shoes to make some money. Manual labor didn't end with the job either. Children to younger adults were also expected to help with the chores as well. Boys would do things such as shovel coal into the furnace to keep the home heated. Girls would have tasks such as cleaning or helping with the cooking. However, there was still time for entertainment, though many activities were quite different from those of today. There were no television, no computers, no widespread use of radio at this point in history. Obviously, there were no cell phones either. In fact, having a phone at all was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford, and it was a shared line where anyone nearby could hear your conversation. In other words, it would not be used to gossip or socialize. For those reasons, young Americans were pretty much responsible for finding their own fun. Indoors, they would do things like play piano, sing, and dance. Outside, those in cities would explore by bicycle or with roller skates. Virtually no one had a car, and it wasn't until 1910 that Henry Ford mass-produced the automobile, and as a consequence made them affordable to the general public. Before that time, most would travel by horses and buggies, streetcars, train, boat, or bicycle. The 1910s to 1920s saw continued innovation and industrialization, though it wasn't until the 20s that manufacturing overtook agriculture as the country's main industry. This was also when those between the age of 8 to 14 were legally required to go to school across the country for the first time in America's history. Those living in rural areas often had a shorter school year so that they could also work on the farm, and when they did attend classes, it was in one room for all grades. In contrast, city schools separated students by grade. Most didn't go on to finish secondary school, as the beginning of the 20s were prosperous, and they could easily find a good-paying job without a high school diploma. The 20s are when many believed the concept of the teenager was first starting to be born, though the term was not yet used. Before this, there were simply children of different ages and adults. Part of the reason sociologists believed that teenagers were starting to be recognized as their own group was because of school, which changed them from just someone of a certain age, not so very different from those a little younger or older, to someone who belonged to his or her own unique culture. School took them from their families and combined them in groups of similarly aged youth in a closed environment completely separate from the outside world. Here is where students began to form their own way of speech, accepted clothing, musical preferences, and other behaviors that were typically at odds with adult role models, specifically their parents. In other words, teenagers were becoming distinctly different from younger children and older adults. This was truer than ever before when consolidated high schools started popping up around the country, the first which was opened in 1922. Further, it was between 1908 and 1927 that Ford's Model T dropped to a low enough cost that as many as 15 million were sold. As a consequence, more and more people had access to one. This is what some historians claim brought about the concept of the independent teen we still recognize today. Before cars, teens typically hung out under the watchful eye of parents. Courtships turned from an old-fashioned informal affair and hanging out as a group, needing permission for something as simple as a moment alone, to an aloneness without restriction. Many considered this period a type of sexual revolution. No longer were people waiting to tie the knot before fooling around, and they were also dating others further away as they could travel greater distances in their automobiles. In addition to attending school daily and a new sense of independence and freedom, entertainment teenagers could enjoy was evolving at this time as well. The first radio station with scheduled broadcasting began on November 2, 1920. Many would also go to the cinema more than once a week since it was considered a cheap form of entertainment. While there were silent pictures in the early 1920s, it wasn't until 1927 that the first picture with sound came out, called the jazz singer. The jazz singer was just one example of the music culture that was taking America by storm. The 20s were known as the Jazz Age for a reason, and youth across the country were dancing the Charleston with girls cutting their hair short and wearing lower cut and shorter hemmed dresses, and boys donning baggy pants. The 1930s brought about the Great Depression. Teenagers could no longer find jobs easily. There was an even greater emphasis placed on education, and high school enrollment went up. This was also the time of the school bus, which meant an end to many one-room schools in rural areas, as students can now be transported to schools elsewhere. This provided a more equitable education for all, no matter their socioeconomic background. In this decade, Congress finally passed well overdue legislation meant to protect youth from abuse in the workplace. The Fair Labor Standards Act made it illegal to employ anyone younger than 16 in the fields of mining or manufacturing. Youth had to be at least 16 to work during the hours of school, 14 to work some jobs after school, and 18 to hold an exceptionally dangerous job. However, despite these protections, it was a rough time due to the floundering economy. Many young people lived on the streets and engaged in criminal activities. However, it was not all bad. Toward the end of this decade was when tiny television sets were first sold, though it wasn't until much later that extensive commercial broadcasting began. The 30s to the 50s were still the time of the radio. It was the way people would listen to music, hear the news, and other types of entertaining programming. Instead of teens scheduling their extracurriculars around TV, they scheduled around their favorite radio show. They enjoyed other things as well. Superman comics were all the rage by June of 1938. The 30s were also when jazz had changed to big band swing. Teens were doing the jitterbug dance in a way of rebellious movement to music that allowed them to push back against the middle-class conventions. The 1940s were when the word teenager with a hyphen between teen and ager began to appear in print. Though the idea had been growing since the 20s with the advent of school and cars, it was post-Depression where it was a formally recognized life stage, distinct from any other. Life magazine wrote a 1944 article trying to define what teenage meant for its millions of readers. It described a teenage American girl as one who finds the most important thing in the world is to be one of a crowd of other girls and to act and speak and dress exactly as they do. Further, they stated that teenage girls were out of touch with the outside world and in fact all but unaware of the war. Instead, their focus was on clothing such as sweaters and loafers, having long hair and rimmed glasses, painting their nails, moron-based jokes, stuffed animals, and boys. Clearly, this must have been somewhat of an exaggeration, but they made their point. The time was quite different for boys, who were sent off to war. Many of those left behind tried to help where they could by collecting materials that could be recycled and used for military equipment. Even once the conflict ended, recovery took time. And when society needed a break from reality, they had several distractions available. TV was growing in popularity, and for those who lived close enough to a station, there were many different types of commercial programming that became available by the end of the decade. In addition to entertainment, newscasts were also aired at this time. What were once radio programs became spin-off TV programs, such as The Jack Benny Show. As a result, network radio drastically declined. The mid-40s brought about the end of the swing craze and made way for bebop. Rhythm and blues music and vocal musicians became more popular and eventually morphed into the rock and roll of the 50s. Music and dancing continued to be a way for the young generation to express themselves and break free of the restrictions held by greater society. Dresses became shorter, and boys wore zoot suits with jackets padded at the shoulders and pants wide on top that tapered at the ankles. The 1950s saw great economic growth and prosperity. Wages increased, including those for older working teens, giving them the freedom to make their own purchases. Many teenagers and their families moved from a dirty and chaotic life in the city to mass-produced homes in suburbia. Following the movement of people, fast food restaurants and shopping centers sprang up nearby. The second McDonald's opened its doors to Americans in 1955. Fancy appliances that had only before been offered to the wealthiest were available to the middle class. This included things such as refrigerators, televisions, and range-top ovens. The first color TV was broadcast in June of 1951, and Leave It to Beaver and The Twilight Zone started airing in 1957 and 1959. By 1955, half of America owned a television set. Rock and roll became the latest craze, and Elvis Presley rose to fame with hip gyrations that were the ultimate shock to the older generations. Teens would go out dancing on Saturday nights to jive along or listen to music on jukeboxes at diners. Girls around this time would wear long skirts with socks, and their hair either up or in curls. Later on, beehives were quite popular. They would also wear clothes that were form-fitting in imitation of Marilyn Monroe, while boys were either clean-cut, bikers, or adopted an Elvis Presley style. The 50s and 60s were also a time when teenage couples found privacy and entertainment at the drive-in theater. It was not uncommon for teenagers to smoke cigarettes as well, though other types of drugs were virtually unheard of. Ultimately, lax discipline following the war and the influence of rock and roll, combined with ever-increasing freedom, resulted in some problems. This environment gave way to the rise of some young gangs. The 1960s brought about cable TV and access to a choice of hundreds of different channels. The Beatles were introduced to the US via this route on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1964. Boys tried to simulate the look of the Beatles with colorful clothing purchases. Overall, teens were making a lot of money and had cash to burn, so businesses began to target them as prospective buyers. Girls would buy short miniskirts and revealing tops and style their hair long. Tie-dye and bell-bottoms rose in popularity as well, though jeans were becoming the most frequently worn pants, particularly Levi's. Because of the past war as well as the threat of nuclear weapons, teens at this time had a live life to the fullest mentality. Woodstock Music and Art Fair was a large celebration attended by 450,000 people in 1969, and there was not one incident of violence. In the 1970s, parents had fewer kids and invested more in the children they had. The top 20% of society began to spend over twice as much on enrichment activities for their families, like summer camps and sports. However, teens seemed to be less optimistic than they were in the 60s. Many had trouble finding jobs and unemployment was on the rise. However, they still enjoyed their music, TV, and self-expression. Musicians such as the Sex Pistols and the Ramones, as well as TV such as Saturday Night Fever, resulted in clothing trends of disco clothes, platform shoes, flared pants, and crop tops. Camouflage was also quite common. So was the creation of the punk, complete with glitter. More and more young male stars led to youth having role models that they could look up to and try to emulate. This was when the concept of the teeny bopper was born. The 80s brought about video cassette recorders and allowed people to record programs or watch movies of their own choosing within their homes. This was also the time when video games became a widespread form of entertainment. The first Macintosh computer was released in 1984. The 80s were also the years that began the importance of being cool via display of the logo. Teens were willing to spend their own or their parents' money on high-priced items that came with a distinctive emblem indicating its exact brand. This continued into the following decade as well. With Madonna's rise to fame, many also copied her style. Clothing was increasingly unisex, with people rocking the punk look designer clothes, and sportswear as society became more interested in health. In fact, teens would often work out with others and wear fitness gear both in and out of gyms. Entertainment was, of course, as important as ever. Teens would spend their weekends clubbing and dancing to hip-hop or rap. They would also watch TV or movies on a daily basis. Unfortunately, many were also turning to drugs. Crack, heroin, and diseases such as AIDS and HIV, thought to be spread through the sharing of needles, became more prevalent. A new focus was placed on safe sex to protect against the disease. The 90s for teens and their families was a time for TV that left its mark on many aspects of their lives. While only thousands of homes had a television set in 1947, all but 2% of the population had one in the 90s. In 1998, high-resolution HD TV television was first aired, and by 1998 many were able to use the internet to view videos and television broadcasts as well. The social life and activity level of teens changed drastically between 1995 and 2015 due to technology. In 1995, teens would watch 2.5 hours of TV each day, and many enjoyed things such as MTV programming. Most families owned a VCR and would rent movies from Blockbuster, which has all since but gone out of business with one store remaining. Still, more than half of teenagers would still find time to talk to their friends on the phone and hang out with others twice a week or more. In 1995, only 11% of teens were considered overweight. By 2005, average media use rose to 6 hours. Netflix began to replace Blockbuster by mailing DVDs to people's homes, and music started to be downloaded from the internet. Teens used the internet more than adults, and this fueled the rise of the MySpace and Facebook era, as well as YouTube. They were still hanging out with friends 2 hours each day and physically active for at least 1 hour, but fears for safety make it less common to spend time outside. Bike riding became less common, and 16% of teens were overweight. By 2015, the time teenagers spent on various media increased even more, now to over 7 hours each day. Most even have TVs in their rooms. They use their phones to listen to music as well as text, which they do more often than having an actual conversation. Most no longer socialize out of school, which has impacted malls and retailers, targeting them as their main source of income. 28% of the teenage population is now overweight. Only 5% don't use the internet, and most who do use it to post their own pictures. Facebook is losing favor in place of Instagram, and apps such as WhatsApp now have almost 1 billion users. The once cool logo has been replaced by technology, and different social media outlets are now the newest way to show off and be judged as well as hook up with others. As we've seen, the concept of the teenager has developed over time, and how this group has lived and behaved changed accordingly.
Was life easier for previous generations? Do teenagers today have a bright future to look forward to, or have they inherited a world more competitive than that of their parents? What do teenagers today spend all day doing? Is a life connected to a handheld device beneficial to today's teenagers, or would they be happier in an unconnected world? Today we'll be looking into the life of modern teenagers and seeing how they spend their time, what they enjoy doing, and how their development could well be hindered by today's rapid lifestyle in this episode of the infographic show, Most Common Traits of Today's Teenagers. Let's first look at the psychology of teenagers and how it develops. So, little Johnny grows up, and around the age of 13, that sweet little smile disappears. He begins to frown and become isolated. If you look close enough at the temples on his head, you might be able to see tiny little horns begin to grow. Johnny seems to be, to his parents' horror, turning into a little monster. Teenagers develop a streak of independence, and parents often find it hard to reach out and relate to them. They are becoming their own person. This is a completely natural part of human evolution that we all experience. The problem is, teenagers are still, for the most part, reliant on their parents. They need their parents for food and shelter, for their education, and for their day-to-day expenses. So although a fierce independence is a teenage trait, in a practical sense, they are still usually being cared for. This creates conflict, and teenagers are normally always experiencing some type of conflict. Teenagers often withdraw into their own space and construct a world whereby they are alone and independent. Nobody, apart from some close friends, really understands them. Nobody has ever experienced the feelings that they are feeling. Teens rely more heavily on their own decisions rather than the advice of their elders, trying to learn how to think and act for themselves for the first time. They find they have separate goals from their parents, their peers, and their teachers, and often isolate themselves with their own thoughts, feelings, and ambitions. Teenagers also begin to take more risks as they grow up. No longer will they need to hold their parents' hand while crossing the road or have a book read to them. Oh no, those years are long behind them. Again, this is to do with evolution. Dr. Paul Mardiket, author of the book The Teenage Brain, observes that the brain of a teenager is not yet fully developed, particularly within the frontal lobes. These lobes are the areas of the brain responsible for decision-making and the weighing up of potential consequences following dangerous activity. Even the most well-balanced teen will have a tendency to behave in ways that seem odd or risky to their elders. But then again, many adults also act in ways that may seem bizarre and risky to a teenager. During the early high school years, kids generally become more extroverted. They begin to establish closer friends within their peer groups rather than their parents. Even teenagers who are naturally introverted will experience a developmental stage in their teens when communication and interaction seem like the most important things in the world. By doing this, teenagers are preparing for early childhood and a time in the future when personal relationships are essential for work and family life. Parents should be willing to let their teenage children spend time with their friends, but monitor who those friends are. Teenagers begin to experience new emotions as they develop. Hormones flood through their body, meaning that they will begin to consider romantic attachments for probably the first time in their lives. Mostly this is harmless flirting online, or perhaps a crush on a celebrity. Sometimes these hormones might lead to early romantic attachments and to coupling with members of their preferred sex. This may be harmless enough, or could lead to unwanted pregnancy and a lifetime commitment that neither teenager is equipped emotionally to deal with, having just left childhood themselves. Parents can't control their children's chemistry, so instead they should educate them on the dangers of early parenthood. But what do teenagers like to do? A family technology education nonprofit group called Common Sense Media surveyed 2,600 youths as recently as November 2015. Their census shows that teens are spending over a third of their average day, or 9 hours, online using social media, watching videos, or listening to music. The survey also showed that teenagers are multitasking. For example, they may be listening to music online while shopping or while traveling to and from school. Teens from lower income backgrounds tend to use online media more often on average in comparison with those teens with higher income families. The 2010 Kaiser Family Foundation study estimated that teenagers are online for 8 hours a day. According to a 2015 survey by Piper Jaffray, teens also do a fair amount of shopping online, with over 60% of teens saying that they prefer to buy clothes over the internet rather than visiting the store and trying on the garments first. Each generation in history is molded not only by their parents' views on the world, but also partly by social, political, cultural, and economic factors. Today's teenagers are among the first whose entire lives has existed with cell phone technology and social media. Psychologist Jean Twenge put this new generation under the microscope in her book iGen. Today's super connected kids are growing up less rebellious, more tolerant, less happy, and completely unprepared for adulthood and what that means for the rest of us. That's quite a mouthful. After looking into a number of national surveys of 11 million teenagers since the 1960s, she concludes that iGens, or modern teens, have a poorer state of mental health in comparison with previous generations. New media causes anxiety, loneliness, and panic disorders, along with sleep loss, according to Dr. Twenge. She comes to these conclusions by pointing to figures displaying national rises in mental health problems among teens and drawing parallels with the increase in cell phones. But what Twenge forgets to mention in her book is that correlation doesn't mean causation. As we mentioned before, teenagers are more sensitive to the world around them due to natural changes in hormone and brain activity, so this could be an equally good explanation as to why mental health problems are on the rise in teens. And then we factor in the larger general awareness of mental health issues, due in part to information on the internet. We also tend to diagnose mental illness earlier nowadays owing to our better understanding of these conditions. Twenge also explains in her book that teenagers are spending less time with their friends in person, and this is difficult to dispute when we look at the alleged 6 hours a day spent on the cell phone. But can this time, if used to chat on social media, really be described as time actually spent alone? And how healthy is this kind of interaction? Teens might be growing up at a slower rate than before. One theory, known as life history theory, postulates that the rate in which teens grow up is in direct correlation with how hostile their immediate environment is, or at least their perception of their environment. So in this theory, a teen growing up in a war-stricken country would, if he survived, be more likely to marry and become a parent at a younger age. If the environment is perceived to be hostile, teens employ a fast life strategy to grow up more rapidly and create larger families to form larger survival groups. On the other side of the coin, a slow life strategy, where the environment is perceived less hostile, gives rise to a slower rate of development. And this might explain why teens are not rushing to buy that car, get married, and have kids as quickly as they did in previous generations. No one can predict for certain what will be the hardest years of your life because no one knows what calamities might befall you. Nonetheless, there are plenty of studies that tell us most people face certain obstacles in life that all tend to happen at certain times. We're sure you've heard of the midlife crisis, or perhaps teenage angst, or those trying times in early adulthood when people need to grow up, get a job, and take responsibility for themselves. Then there are the vagaries of old age, the specter of debilitating arthritis, incurable diseases, knowing the Grim Reaper is checking Google Maps to find out how to get to your house. Today, we'll look at when most people face the most difficulties. In this episode of the Infographic Show, what will be the hardest years of your life. We'll start with the easiest years. There can be no doubt that the easiest years of your life are those just after you are born. We can't call these your hard years as there isn't really a sense of you. You are developing a sense of self or an ego. We won't argue with psychologists, however, that suffering trauma as a young child might have an effect on the development of that child. Some kids are beaten badly by their parents, even as infants, and studies show that beaten children are more likely to develop mental health problems. This might be anxiety, depression, inability to empathize with others, or they might be more likely to abuse drugs. If you've seen our serial killer shows, you'll know many of those crazed killers grew up with violent parents. However, as we said, as you haven't quite developed a sense of you, these years are still easy sailing. When the ego gets going, so do your problems. That's when the trauma kicks in. That said, when you truly know yourself, accept who you are, and even accept your mortality, life can become quite easy. That's why a lot of people say life gets easier once you get out of the middle-age years. As one person writes on his blog, I am closing in on 71, though I am told I do not look it. I certainly don't feel it. I am one that believes in the importance in continuous learning and trying lots of new things. You are never too late to start. I started writing this blog at 64. Getting old gracefully really depends on what you've set up for yourself and also includes a lot of luck. If you're broke, without friends, have no hobbies or even ambitions, then old age can be a drag. You might find yourself a grumpy old person in a home next to a Grandpa Simpson-like neighbor. Listen to the wise words of American novelist Henry Miller, who started writing late and wrote essays on living a meaningful life when he was in old age. Miller once said, "The moment one gives close attention to anything, even a blade of grass, it becomes a mysterious, awesome, indescribably magnificent world in itself." The aim of life is to live, and to live means to be aware, joyously, drunkenly, serenely, divinely aware. If you kept fit throughout life, especially the middle years, stayed curious, kept learning, and saved a bit of cash, old age can be far easier than those years when you never stopped needing things and every day was a fight for survival. Hopefully you'll be one of those old folks that tells tales of a full life and not through a machine connected to your once cancerous neck. Now we get to the harder years. The teenage years come next. Teens may gripe a lot about life, but anyone who has been through those years knows they are generally easier than what's coming, i.e., taking full responsibility for yourself. The problem with these years is they start with you trying to deal with the pecking order and finish with teens trying to deal with the transition to become adults. It all depends on how you grow up. It's no fun being poor as a teen and dealing with kids at school bullying you for it. One day, if you hold in there, you will have the power to become who you want. But teens generally are not able to escape whatever reality they know. These are the years that bad parenting really hurts, when some kids run away from home when they are old enough and have enough awareness to realize things are not right at home. For those teens, life is a minefield, and we can see that in suicide rates. Young kids generally don't take their own lives, but then in the teens, that rate gets much higher. Kids have to deal with life, and deal with who they are. Still, the teen years show easily the lowest suicide rate for all stages of a life after preteen, in the USA at least. Most kids, after all, don't deal with daily beatings and abuse at home. Even kids with caring parents can get stressed by parents' expectations. Spoiled kids, on the other hand, may think they have it easy, but things will get hard in adulthood for someone who has always got what they wanted. Psychology today simply says the spoiled person is discontented. Such a person is unhappy, and it falls to parents to prevent their child from growing up this way. They are tricky years, but in the end, someone generally has your back. One teen girl said, "Social status matters so much today, and it's all about how you handle yourself on social media." So yes, you'll have to fight through pecking orders, traverse the minefield of other kids and their taunts, but most kids, generally all kids, face this without insurmountable problems. You'll also see your body has changed, and those hormonal shifts can bring pimples to your face and put you in bad moods. You'll be nervous, no doubt, about a first kiss, about making love, about becoming a man or a woman, but again, everyone has to go through this, and generally these fears are easily overcome. Enjoy it while you can, because life is going to get harder. The next stage is from the age of around 30 to 45. You are not yet middle-aged, but certainly are over your growing pains. These are the years when you'll likely find a career path, when you might get married and have children of your own, when you might get divorced, when, if you had a bad childhood, you might come to terms with that. It's also the age things might fall apart. When you watch your friends succeed, when you are inundated with photos on Facebook showing perfect, happy marriages, your long-lost buddies traveling the globe, them sporting the best new clothes and driving flashy cars. You're still wondering where everyone went, downing a Xanax and vodka in your one-bedroom flat, listening to 90s music while measuring your receding hairline. This can be a trying time. One thing for you now to know is you must move on. It's time to leave the cocoon of youth and become a butterfly. So what if you don't get married or don't have the best job in the world? Don't get down looking at how others live. You must change yourself. You are not too old to start something new. If you don't have kids, see that as a reason to do all the things people with kids can't do. Okay, so your school buddy is rich, but he works long hours at an office in the rat race. Is that always a good thing? Do nice cars make people happy? You'll find the answer is no. Surviving these years is all about accepting change, accepting the loss of youth, and adapting to your future. Sure, these years are hard because many people just can't cope with this. On the other hand, people may be stuck in an unhappy marriage or a job they hate. They won't always admit that. That's no reason to roll over and hit the Prozac, as many people do during this stage of life. It's a reason to dig in and make some changes. It's the time you embrace the adage, carpe diem, seize the day. The next stage is what we might call middle age, from 45 to 60. Maybe you didn't make those good decisions we just talked about. You just stayed in the bad job, the terrible marriage, you kept hitting the booze, and let yourself go physically. These are the years when most people take their own lives. It all depends on how you set this time up. If you lived an unhealthy life and didn't take care of yourself, these are also the years you can expect to see some results related to that insalubrious living. Bad knees, replaced hips, off-the-chart cholesterol, blood sugar in the red, missing teeth, and a lower back that can't support you without an unfashionable brace. You are also at that stage where you will have to accept you are entering into the twilight years. That doesn't mean you can't run marathons, but it might mean slowing down. Yep, we've all heard of the guys that buy Harley-Davidson motorcycles during this stage of life, not knowing how to adapt to these years. Psychologists tell us it's during this stage we face generativity, or stagnation. The former means giving, teaching others, even creating works of art or business manuals that might teach others. You have a lot to give, and now you are less selfish, working for the betterment of the majority. Stagnation means just that, getting to this stage and not contributing anything to anyone, feeling worthless or irrelevant. Lots of people turn to therapy at this stage in their lives. Our advice is to try not to become so self-absorbed. You can't stop this passing of time. Hair transplants, or fake breasts, or new cars are temporary fixes, but the roots of your soul will still be infused with discontent. You have to give out, not give up. Focus not only on you, but on how you can make other people's lives better. The hardest part of being alive? Well, we are told that it is the 20s, or perhaps the period between the very late teens and the early 30s. This period doesn't have the highest suicide rate, but the 20s can be a very testing time. Most people are thrown out of the nest and are told to literally get a life. They have the burden of responsibility. While many studies suggest the university years can be easy, let's remember some people don't go to uni. Those that do will likely graduate in their early 20s anyways. Psychology Today writes, what seems bewildering or insurmountable when we are 20 is usually much less threatening when we are 40 and maybe a breeze when we are 60. I'm talking about the heart, mind, and spirit, not the body. These are the years you have to fight, and you'll get little respect from others. You are too old to be mollycoddled by your parents, but embarrassingly, you can't quite stop needing their help. You're like a badly made grown-up. On the outside, things look normal, but on the inside, you don't function properly yet. You've still got nagging parents, you've got debt, you have little self-control, and because of that, you are likely to do many stupid things on many occasions. You are just not fully formed. At least your brain isn't. You have freedom, but you don't know how to handle it. Studies have shown that when older people were asked what stage of life was the hardest, most said the 20s, a stage they really wouldn't want to go through again if by some miracle it was possible. We guess for other wild animals, this is the stage when the young ones have to fend for themselves. They are just not very good at it yet. Few people are masters of anything in their 20s, even if they deny it. The 20s are also a time of big egos, which in turn can lead to hubris and depression in the 30s when they discover their brilliance wasn't a reality. You'll need good support networks. You'll need self-control lest your freedom backfire on you, rein in your powers and harness your strengths. You are Spider-Man before you can use his superpowers correctly. It helps to meditate a bit on who you are and what you want in life and talk to others about that. Now's the time most midlifers should be doing what they're supposed to be doing and giving back, helping you out, or even writing the books or blogs that lessen your confusion and pain. Just because life can be hard doesn't mean that learning new skills has to be. Skillshare makes learning and improving your life convenient and easy, with online classes from cooking to entrepreneurship. Premium membership will give you unlimited access to topics that will improve your skills and, in the process, your life. Join the millions of people who are using Skillshare and get 2 months free by going to skillshare.com/infographics35 or by clicking the link in the description and start learning today. So, what have been the most trying years for you? What do you think will be the hardest period? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called Why You Will Never Be Rich. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time!